She laughed at him in front of everyone, and that single moment of contempt would cost her company more than she could have imagined. Victoria Sterling, CEO of one of the most powerful performance car companies in the world, stood in her private showroom in a red dress that commanded every room she walked into, surrounded by engineers who had spent 4 years building a $5 million hypercar, and none of them could make it start. One mechanic. $899. One warning she chose to ignore. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and let's get into it. The showroom had been designed to make people feel small. That was the point, actually. Not that anyone at Sterling Performance Motors would have said it out loud, but the architecture made the intention obvious enough. 30-foot ceilings, walls of brushed titanium and tempered glass, lighting rigs positioned at precise angles so that every vehicle on display seemed to generate its own internal glow, as though the cars were the ones doing the illuminating and the humans were simply visitors in their world. The floor was a single continuous pour of white epoxy resin, and it was kept so clean that a man could eat off it, though no one ever did, because no one who worked in that building ate lunch without checking over their shoulder first. Sterling Performance Motors occupied a sprawling campus on the eastern edge of Scottsdale, Arizona, wedged between a private airstrip and 40 acres of Sonoran desert that the company had bought expressly to prevent anyone from building next to them. The campus itself was a study in controlled intimidation. There were 3 separate buildings: engineering, administration, and the showroom, connected by covered walkways made of the same brushed titanium as the walls inside. Security cameras were everywhere. Visitor badges had RFID chips. The parking lot had a separate lane for executives, marked with small brass plaques that bore only initials, because anyone who needed a full name to know which spot was theirs didn't belong here. This was Victoria Sterling's world. She had not inherited it, she had built it. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Her grandfather, Leonard Sterling, had started the company in 1971 as a one-car custom shop in Tempe, building race-tuned engines for amateur drag racers who wanted more than what Detroit was willing to give them. Her father, Robert Sterling, had taken that shop and turned it into a boutique manufacturer producing limited-run performance vehicles for wealthy collectors. But it was Victoria who had transformed it into what it was now, a genuinely formidable player in the global hypercar market. The kind of company that got invited to auto shows in Geneva and Tokyo and Dubai. The kind of company whose wait lists stretched 3 years and whose vehicles appeared in the background of movies because production designers thought they looked like the future. She had done that. Over 18 years, through decisions that were sometimes inspired and sometimes brutal, and occasionally both at the same time. On the morning of what would later become the most expensive 30 seconds of her professional life, Victoria Sterling arrived at the showroom at 7:45. She arrived at this time every morning, 45 minutes before her executive team, because she liked the building when it was quiet. She liked walking through it alone, seeing the cars without anyone around to narrate them to her. She was wearing the red dress. She wore it on days when she needed something from people. Not because she was unaware of its effect, but because she was completely aware of it and had long since made her peace with that awareness. It was a bright crimson bodycon dress, spaghetti straps, a V neckline that was deep without being theatrical. It fit her exactly right because she'd had it altered twice. She paired it with low heels. She'd learned early that heels above 2 inches were a liability in a manufacturing facility, and she never wore anything she couldn't run in, even in a showroom. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her only jewelry was a simple watch her father had given her the year before he died. A Patek Philippe with a white dial and a crack in the crystal she'd never fixed. She walked through the showroom slowly, coffee in hand, and stopped in front of the car. The Prometheus. 4.5 years of development, a budget that had exceeded $60 million before the first prototype rolled off the assembly line. A twin-turbocharged flat-plane V8 engine producing 1,400 horsepower and 900 pound-feet of torque. Carbon fiber monocoque chassis. An active aerodynamic system that adjusted in real time based on GPS data, weather sensors, and what the company's engineers called predictive road intelligence, which was a phrase they had tested extensively with focus groups before deciding it sounded sufficiently impressive without crossing into obvious hyperbole. The sticker price was $4.9 million. There were 11 units allocated for the first production run. 7 had already been spoken for by buyers who had signed purchase agreements and put down deposits of $250,000 each. The remaining 4 were being held for the International Launch Event, a private exhibition in Geneva in 11 days that Victoria had spent the better part of 2 years orchestrating. She stood in front of it and drank her coffee and thought about the Geneva trip, about the hotel suite she'd booked for the week, about the presentation she still needed to revise, about the journalist from the Financial Times who had requested an exclusive interview and whose questions she'd already read through twice and found mostly easy except for the third one, which was about the company's debt-to-equity ratio and which she was still deciding how to reframe. At 8:22, her chief engineer walked in. Daniel Okafor had been at Sterling for 9 years. He was a careful, methodical man who did not like to bring problems to Victoria unless he had already attempted to solve them twice and failed both times. The fact that he was walking toward her at 8:22 before the rest of the team had arrived, before anyone else was in the building, told her something was wrong. "Tell me," she said before he reached her. He stopped about 6 feet away. He was holding a tablet. "The Prometheus won't start." She looked at him. "Explain that." "We attempted a full systems power-up at 6 this morning for the pre-shipping diagnostic. The vehicle powered up to about 40%, interior lights, infotainment, basic electrical, and then shut down. We've tried 11 times since then. Same result each time. Gets to 40% system readiness and then goes dark." Victoria looked at the car. It looked perfect. It sat on its display platform with the arrogant stillness of something that knew it was beautiful and had nothing to prove about it. "Error codes," she said. 17 distinct codes across 4 systems. The problem is they're contradicting each other. 2 of the codes indicate a fuel delivery issue. 2 indicate a battery management problem. 3 indicate a calibration error in the ECU. The rest are in the active aero subsystem. When you have codes pointing in 4 different directions simultaneously, it usually means the codes themselves aren't telling you what the actual problem is. They're symptoms, not the source. How long to diagnose and fix? If we knew what we were looking for, a day, maybe 2. He paused. The problem is we don't know what we're looking for. Victoria set her coffee cup down on the edge of a display pedestal. A maintenance worker who happened to be passing through the far end of the showroom saw her do it and changed direction to go get a coaster, but she didn't notice. "You've been the chief engineer on this project for 4 years, Daniel." "I have." "And you don't know what's wrong with it." "Correct." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the desert was already bright. The sky, the particular shade of washed-out blue that only appeared in Arizona in early spring. "I'll get the team in early," Daniel said. "Full team. Everyone who worked on the powertrain, the electronics, the software integration, will approach it systematically." "Do that," she said. Dab. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, there were 11 engineers in the showroom, and the Prometheus still would not start. They had run 4 complete diagnostic sweeps. They had pulled apart the battery management interface, checked every electrical connection in the powertrain bay, reviewed 3 years' worth of software update logs, and replaced the primary ECU module with a spare unit from the parts inventory. The result was the same each time. The car would power up to approximately 40% system readiness and then shut down without producing any new diagnostic information. Marcus Hale stood at the edge of the activity with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who was thinking very hard but choosing not to share what he was thinking. Marcus was the company's chief technology officer. He was 46 years old, precise in his dress, and imprecise in his personal warmth, and he had worked at Sterling for 12 years, which made him the longest-tenured executive other than Victoria herself. He and Victoria had a working relationship that functioned well when they needed it to and frayed at the edges when it didn't, which was more frequently than either of them would have preferred. He was good at his job in the way that some people were good at their job, completely, but only at their job, with a narrow and consistent unwillingness to consider anything outside the set of things he had already decided to consider. At 2:15, he pulled Victoria aside near the back of the showroom. "I've contacted 3 external consultants," he said. One in Stuttgart, one in Tokyo, one in Detroit. I can have them on a call tonight. How much? Consultation fees, between the three of them, probably 40 to 60,000 for the initial assessment. And if we need them on site? Different conversation? Victoria looked at the car. Three of the engineers were crouched around the engine bay. One of them was looking at a tablet. Another one was looking at the same tablet. Who else have we tried locally? I've exhausted my list. She looked at him. Marcus, I'm asking a practical question. Is there anyone in the Phoenix metro area who specializes in this kind of diagnostic work? Complex multi-system integration problems, unusual fault behavior, who isn't already on our staff? Our staff is among the best in the country. And right now our best can't make the car start. She said it flatly, not cruelly. So the question stands. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked like he was doing a calculation. There's a name that came up in an industry forum about 6 months ago. Independent. Works out of a small shop in Mesa. What kind of work? Diagnostics, primarily. He's developed a reputation for taking on problems that other shops can't solve. The forum thread was about a Bugatti Chiron with an unusual ECU behavior that 3 European specialists had passed on. He apparently solved it in about 4 hours. What's his name? Mercer. Ethan Mercer. Call him. Victoria. Call him today. On. Ethan Mercer's shop did not look like anything. It sat on a corner lot in Mesa, squeezed between an auto parts store and a dry cleaner, in a strip that had probably been built in the late 80s and had not been substantially updated since. The exterior was painted the particular beige of a building that had been painted too many times, each new coat slightly different from the last until the color lost any relationship to an actual color. The sign above the bay doors read, Mercer Diagnostic and Technical, in letters that had once been red but were now mostly pink from a decade of Arizona sun. There were 3 bay doors, one of which was open. The parking lot had 4 spaces and a crack in the asphalt that had been filled with tar at some point and had since developed its own additional cracks. He arrived at the Sterling showroom the following morning at 9 o'clock. He was 38 years old, and he looked like someone who spent most of his time thinking rather than being seen, which was an accurate characterization. Medium height, brown hair that was a little too long to be intentional and not long enough to be a statement. He wore jeans that weren't new and a gray work shirt with the shop name stitched over the chest pocket in the same faded red as the sign outside. He carried a black tool bag over one shoulder and a laptop in a neoprene sleeve under his arm. He had driven himself. He did not have an assistant. The receptionist at the Sterling front desk had been told to expect him and led him through the building to the showroom, where Victoria was already present along with Marcus, Daniel Okafor, and 4 of the senior engineers. She had assembled them deliberately. If they were going to bring in an outsider, she wanted her team watching, partly so they could learn anything useful, and partly because she wanted everyone in the room to understand that the situation had become serious enough to require external help. When Ethan walked in, Victoria was standing near the car. She registered him in the way she registered most people who entered a room she was in, quickly, categorically, then filed. He was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to articulate what she had expected. Someone more polished, perhaps. Someone who looked more like the problem he was being asked to solve. He crossed the showroom floor and extended his hand. Ethan Mercer. Victoria Sterling. She shook it. Thank you for coming. Sure. He looked at the car. Not at her. Not at the room. Just the car. He stood there for a moment in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but had a quality to it, like he was listening to something none of them could hear. You can take me through what you know, he said, still looking at the car. Daniel Okafor gave him the summary. 4 years of development, the power-up failure, the 17 contradictory fault codes, the ECU replacement, the 4 failed diagnostic sweeps, the 2 weeks remaining before Geneva. Ethan listened without interrupting. He did not take notes. When Daniel finished, he asked 3 questions. What was the sequence of software updates applied in the last 6 months? Were there any changes to the active aerodynamics firmware after the final pre-production sign-off? And was there a full system state log from the initial power-up attempt available? Daniel said he'd have to pull the logs from the server. Ethan said that would be helpful. Then he set his bag down and unzipped it. "What's your rate?" Marcus said. He said it in a tone that was technically a question but functioned as something else. Ethan looked up from the bag. $8.99 for the diagnostic. There was a moment of silence in the room. Then Victoria laughed. It wasn't a malicious laugh, or at least it didn't start as one. It was the automatic response of someone who heard a number so far below what they expected that their brain categorized it as a joke before they could decide how to respond. $899. She had engineers on payroll whose hourly rate exceeded that. The consultants Marcus had called in Stuttgart and Tokyo were charging $12,000 for the initial call. But she laughed, and everyone in the room heard it, and when she looked up from the laugh, she saw him watching her with an expression that was very still and very level, and she understood immediately that the laugh had landed somewhere she hadn't intended it to. "I'm sorry," she said. I didn't mean, it's fine." He wasn't angry. That was the thing. He wasn't embarrassed or wounded or gathering himself to deliver a retort. He was just still. He zipped the bag back up and stood. "The price is the price," he said. "That's how I work. If that's not going to be workable, I understand." "No, it's fine," Victoria said quickly. "We can absolutely—" $8.99 feels a little light, Marcus said. He crossed his arms. "For a problem that a team of certified engineers hasn't been able to crack." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "That's not how diagnostic pricing works. It's not based on how hard the problem is. It's based on the time I spend on it." "And how much time are you expecting to spend on it?" "I don't know yet. That's the point of the diagnostic." "What if you don't find anything?" "Then you don't pay me." Marcus made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "And what if you find something? Are you expecting some kind of success bonus on top of the $8.99? Ethan picked up his bag. He picked up the laptop. He looked at the car for a second, then back at Marcus, then at Victoria. "I'll be straightforward," he said. "This car isn't going to be fixed by running more standard diagnostics. Whatever is wrong here isn't in the places your team has already looked. If you bring in the consultants from Stuttgart or Tokyo or wherever, they're going to charge you significantly more than I would, and they're going to tell you the same things your team has already told you because they're going to approach the problem the same way your team approached it. What you need is someone who's willing to start somewhere different." He paused. "That said, I'm not interested in working somewhere I'm not wanted. If this isn't the right fit, that's fine." He looked at Victoria one more time, not with anger, not with resentment, with the patient clarity of someone delivering information they've already decided not to repeat. "Then this car will never run again," he said. "Not before Geneva." He walked out. The showroom was very quiet after the door closed behind him. Marcus said, "We don't need him," and no one responded immediately, which was itself a response. They didn't call him back that day. Victoria told herself she had made a reasonable decision. Her engineering team was excellent. The international consultants Marcus had arranged were top tier. The problem was complex, but it wasn't insurmountable. They had 11 days. That was enough time. She drove home that evening past the desert going orange in the late light and thought about the way Ethan Mercer had looked at the Prometheus when he first walked in. Not the way her engineers looked at it. They looked at it with familiarity, with ownership, with the slightly defensive posture of people who had built something and were now being asked why it wasn't working. He had looked at it the way you'd look at something you'd never seen before that you were genuinely curious about. She dismissed the thought. It was a car. Curiosity was not a diagnostic methodology. On the third day, the Stuttgart consultant arrived. He was a German engineer named Rolf, who wore dress shoes to a working showroom and used the phrase "from a systems architecture perspective" approximately every 4 minutes. He was accompanied by an assistant who took notes on everything Rolf said in a leather-bound notebook, as though the notes were themselves a deliverable. Together, they spent 6 hours running diagnostics and produced a 40-page report that concluded, with great specificity and at a cost of $19,000, that the fault was likely in the integration layer between the active aerodynamics firmware and the primary ECU, which was a sentence Daniel Okafor had already written in an internal memo 4 days earlier. They flew home the next morning. The Tokyo consultant joined the next day by video call, reviewed the same diagnostic logs, and suggested replacing the aerodynamics control unit entirely. Marcus authorized the order. The unit arrived from the supplier in 48 hours, cost $22,000, and when installed, produced the exact same result: 40% system readiness, then shutdown. The error log now had 23 fault codes. Victoria stood in the showroom that evening after everyone else had gone home and looked at the car and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in her own facility: helpless. The launch was in 8 days. She had $230,000 in unauthorized expenditures on parts and consultation that she was going to have to explain to the board. The car would not start. She started going through the archive on a Tuesday. It was not something she had planned to do. She was in the engineering wing looking for records of the original powertrain specifications. She had a theory she wanted to check, something about the baseline ECU calibration from the first-generation prototype. And the digital archive only went back 6 years, so she asked the records manager, a quiet woman named Patricia, who had been with the company for 20 years and knew where everything was, whether there were earlier records in physical form. Patricia said there were. They were in a storage room on the second floor. Victoria spent 3 hours up there. The original engineering team for what eventually became the Prometheus program had started their work before it had a name, back when it was referred to internally as Project Helix. The foundational engine platform, the core architecture from which the Prometheus 5.8 had been derived, had been designed in that period by a small team. Victoria went through the personnel files, which were clipped to the back of a thick binder of technical specifications. There were 5 names on the original Helix engine team. The 4th one was Ethan Mercer. She read it twice. The file was brief: a contractor designation, a period of engagement spanning 18 months, a project role listed as Senior Powertrain Integration Engineer. There was a headshot paperclip to the corner, printed in low resolution on company letterhead, and she had to tilt it toward the light to see it clearly, but it was him. Younger, different haircut, the same stillness in the eyes. She sat on a box of old catalogs and held the folder and looked at it for a long time. She went back downstairs and found Marcus in his office. Ethan Mercer worked on the Helix program, she said, standing in his doorway. Marcus looked up from his desk. His expression didn't change, which was itself informative. "I know," he said. "You know." She stepped into the office. "You knew that when I asked you who we should bring in. You gave me his name without mentioning that he was one of the original engineers on the engine platform that the Prometheus is built on. His involvement was a long time ago. Marcus. He helped design the core architecture, the thing that no one can diagnose, and you told me he was someone you'd seen mentioned in a form." She closed the door behind her. "Why?" Marcus set his pen down. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the calculation he was running. How much to give, what angle to take, where the defensible line was. She had seen him run this calculation before, in quarterly reviews and budget meetings, and the occasional difficult conversation about strategic direction. He was very good at it. That was part of what made him useful. "Ethan and I have a history," he said. "Tell me." "We were at the same company before I came here, about 14 years ago. There was a dispute over a technical decision, a significant one. It affected both our careers. He left the industry for a while afterward. I don't know all the details of what happened to him after that." "Was the dispute about something he did, or something you did?" He didn't answer immediately. "Marcus." "It was more complicated than that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 40-page Stuttgart report, about the $22,000 control unit sitting in the Prometheus that had changed nothing, about the 19 days between now and Geneva, which had been 11 days 6 days ago. "Get him back in here," she said. "Victoria, I don't think—" "Get him back in here." She went herself. She had considered sending Marcus, then immediately rejected it. She had considered sending Daniel, then rejected that too. This was a thing she had caused, and she was going to handle it herself. That was a principle she developed early and kept to through things much worse than this. She drove to Mesa the next morning. The shop looked even smaller in person than it had sounded in description. She parked in one of the 4 spaces and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running, air conditioning on, looking at the faded letters on the sign. Mercer Diagnostic and Technical. She went in through the open bay. He was under a car, a dark blue Porsche 911, older model, raised on a hydraulic lift. She could see his boots and the lower half of his jeans. She heard the sound of something being ratcheted. "Mr. Mercer," she said. A pause. Then the ratcheting stopped. He rolled out from under the car on a creeper, shielding his eyes from the change in light, and looked up at her. She was standing in her showroom dress. Not the red one, a different one, navy, less aggressive, and she was aware of how she looked in this space, which was not how she usually looked anywhere. He sat up, said nothing. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I laughed at you in front of my team. That was disrespectful, and it was wrong. I'm sorry." He looked at her steadily. She had the impression he was deciding whether the apology was real, which was a fair thing to decide. "And," she said, "I've since learned things I didn't know when you were there, about your history with the project, with the engine platform. I understand now that when you said the car wouldn't start before Geneva, it wasn't a bluff, it was an assessment." He wiped his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his back pocket. "How'd you find out?" "The archive. Personnel files from the Helix program." He nodded slowly. 18 months of my life, that program. Best work I've ever done. The Prometheus is built on that work. "I know." He looked at the rag in his hands. "I've known what car you were calling about since I got the call. Recognized the description of the fault behavior." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "You knew and you still came." "I was curious." And then Marcus said, she stopped. "Is your history with Marcus the reason you're working out of a shop in Mesa?" He looked at her in a way that said it wasn't a simple question and that the answer deserved more respect than a quick summary in someone else's showroom. "That's a longer story," he said. "Fair enough?" He stood. He was taller than she remembered, or the space made the difference more apparent. He leaned against the fender of a car parked nearby, a Mustang waiting for something, and crossed his arms. "What exactly are you asking me?" he said. "I'm asking you to come back, on your terms, whatever you need, whoever needs to be in the room or out of it, whatever the conditions are. I want the car fixed. More than that..." She stopped, restarted. "I need to know what's wrong with it. I need to understand what happened." He looked at her for a while. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned over 18 years of running a company that people often gave you more if you stopped filling silences. "Everyone watches," he said finally, "and no one touches anything while I'm working. No suggestions, no corrections, no one on their phone running alternative diagnoses in the background. Everyone watches, including Marcus, and no one says a word." "Agreed. And I get paid $8.99. "Yes." He almost smiled. Not quite. "That's not a negotiating position. That's actually what it costs." "I know." He picked up a jacket from a hook by the bay door. "I'll follow you there," he said. But the showroom had a different quality to it when the 10 people in it were being asked to be quiet. Victoria had assembled the full engineering team plus Marcus. She had told them that Ethan Mercer was returning, that he had specific conditions for his work, and that those conditions were non-negotiable. She had looked at Marcus when she said this and held his gaze until he nodded, which he did with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that he was standing on thin ice and had chosen walking very carefully as his strategy. Ethan arrived. He set his bag down. He opened his laptop. He didn't start by connecting anything. He stood in front of the Prometheus for about 3 minutes doing nothing, and Victoria watched her engineers watching him, and she could see the particular discomfort of technically minded people observing someone doing something they couldn't categorize as a methodology. Then he crouched down by the driver's side wheel arch and studied something near the lower body panel. Stood, walked around to the rear, crouched again. Stood. He looked at the laptop, typed, scrolled, Then he went to the engine bay and crouched for a while, not touching anything, just looking. 7 minutes in, he stood up and went to his bag and retrieved a small cable and an interface module Victoria didn't recognize. He connected it to a port under the dash, not the OBD port, a different port, smaller, tucked behind a trim panel. "What port is that?" Daniel Okafor asked quietly. Nobody answered him because the condition was silence. Ethan worked the laptop. His face was calm. His face had been calm the entire time. Whatever he was seeing on the screen, it wasn't giving him the kind of visible reaction that would tell anyone in the room what he was finding. Then he stopped. He looked at the screen for a long moment. He scrolled back up. He looked again. He stood and looked at Marcus. "Who approved the firmware update to the active aerodynamics calibration stack on February 14th? He said. The room got very still. Marcus said, "Updates go through the standard approval chain. The system log shows a single approver, not a chain, one person. Direct approval, February 14th. Marcus was quiet. "Marcus," Victoria said. "I approved a calibration update," he said. "It was a performance optimization, standard procedure." "Did you run it through the integration test protocol with the ECU?" Ethan asked. Silence. "Because the update created a timing conflict between the aerodynamics firmware and the engine management system. They're issuing contradictory instructions to the same sensor array. When the car reaches 40% system readiness, the ECU tries to hand off to the aero system, and the aero system sends it back because the calibration parameters don't match. Neither system can establish priority, so they both shut down." He looked at the laptop screen. "The fix takes about 4 minutes. The room was completely silent. Victoria looked at the Prometheus, then at Marcus. Marcus's expression was the expression of someone who had been in a car accident and was still in the moment right after impact, doing the inventory of what was broken. "Do it," Victoria said. Ethan sat down in front of the laptop. He worked for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She counted, without meaning to count. It was just what she did with time in tense situations. He tapped a key, waited, tapped again. "Someone want to try the starter?" he said. Daniel Okafor reached past the open door and touched the starter contact. The Prometheus started instantly. The sound of that engine in the enclosed showroom was enormous and clean and perfect, and it ran with a steadiness that said it had never had a problem at all, that it had simply been waiting for someone to ask it the right question. 2 of the junior engineers made sounds they hadn't planned to make. Someone started clapping and then stopped because it felt like the wrong response to something that felt too large for applause. Victoria stood very still with her hands at her sides and looked at the car running and thought about what it had cost her. Not in money, though the money was real and would require uncomfortable conversations, but in the specific currency of having been wrong when she was certain she was right. Ethan closed his laptop. He unplugged the cable. He put both things in his bag. He picked up the bag and stood up and looked at her. $8.99, he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it seemed insufficient, "Thank you." He nodded. He looked at the car one more time, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, just with the same clear interest he'd had when he first saw it, like it was still a puzzle that happened to be solved, and the being solved was almost beside the point. He zipped the bag. He walked to the exit. The Prometheus kept running behind him, steady and certain, filling the showroom with sound. The Prometheus ran for 6 minutes and 40 seconds before Victoria asked Daniel to shut it down. She didn't have a practical reason for the exact duration. It wasn't a systems check. The engine had proven itself in the first 30 seconds. It wasn't a warm-up cycle. She let it run because she needed to stand in that room and hear it and let the reality of the past week settle against the reality of this moment, and she needed that to take as long as it took. The sound of the engine was a kind of reckoning. $230,000 in consultants and replacement parts, and 17 days of collective paralysis, all of it resolved in less time than it took her to drive from her house to the office every morning. When Daniel cut the power, the silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Nobody spoke for a moment. The engineers were doing the thing that engineers do when they've just witnessed something that restructures their understanding of what happened. They were going back over the sequence in their heads, remapping it, refiling it. She could see it on their faces, the particular expression of people recalculating. Marcus stood near the rear of the car with his arms at his sides now, no longer crossed. He was looking at the floor, not at her, and the fact that he was not looking at her was itself a statement. She let it be a statement for now. "Daniel," she said, "full diagnostic sweep, all systems. I want a complete health report before end of day. Then we begin pre-shipping prep." "Yes." "Start the Geneva checklist from the top. Treat the last 2 weeks as if they didn't happen. I want fresh eyes on every system. No assumptions." Daniel was already reaching for his tablet. "Understood." She looked at the rest of the team. They were watching her with the particular attentiveness of people who sensed that the atmosphere in the room had changed in a way they hadn't fully characterized yet. "Good work," she said, and she meant it partially, which was as much as she could honestly mean it right now. They had worked hard. They had worked the wrong direction, but they had worked hard, and those were two separate things. She didn't look at Marcus again before she left the showroom. She went to her office, closed the door, sat down, and looked at the wall for approximately 90 seconds before she picked up her phone and called the company's outside legal counsel. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before she decided what to do about it. What? The conversation with her attorney lasted 40 minutes. Margaret Cho had been Victoria's personal counsel for 11 years, which meant she had seen Victoria in a range of situations and had developed the particular skill of understanding what Victoria actually needed from a conversation as distinct from what Victoria said she was asking. What Victoria said she was asking this afternoon was whether a CTO approving a firmware update without running it through the standard integration test protocol constituted a breach of his employment agreement. What she was actually asking was whether what Marcus had done was bad enough to act on immediately, or whether it was the kind of thing that could be managed through internal process. Margaret listened, asked 4 questions, and then said, "Tell me what you found in the archive." Victoria told her about the Helix personnel file, about Ethan's role as a senior powertrain integration engineer, about the 18 months of work, about the fact that Marcus had given her Ethan's name without mentioning any of this. Margaret was quiet for a moment, and Marcus knew about Mercer's history with the project. "He said he did, when I confronted him directly." "Did he give you a reason for not disclosing it?" "He said they had a professional history, a dispute about 14 years ago. He said it was complicated." "Okay." Another pause. "Here's where you are. The firmware approval without integration testing is documentable and potentially actionable depending on what his employment agreement says about technical decision authority at that level. I'll need to look at the agreement, but my initial read is that something with that kind of systemic impact should have gone through a broader review process. If he bypassed that deliberately, it's a problem. If he bypassed it through negligence, it's a different kind of problem, but still a problem. What about the Mercer disclosure? That's murkier. There's no formal obligation for an executive to disclose a personal history with a potential vendor unless it creates a conflict of interest. The argument you'd need to make is that his failure to disclose materially affected your ability to make a sound business decision, which... Margaret paused in the way she always paused when she was about to say something that was legally accurate but tactically uncomfortable. Which you could make, but you'd also be making the implicit argument that you relied on his judgment to the exclusion of doing your own due diligence. Victoria absorbed this. Meaning, it reflects on me too. Meaning, any proceeding that scrutinizes his conduct will also scrutinize the environment in which that conduct went unchecked. That's not a reason not to act, it's just a factor. After she hung up, Victoria sat at her desk for a long time with her hands flat on the surface. The desk was glass-topped, and she could see her own hands through it, which was a detail she normally didn't notice and was noticing now. She thought about the version of herself that had laughed in the showroom 8 days ago. The version that had looked at a man in a gray work shirt with a faded logo and filed him under a category and closed the file. She had been doing that her whole career, running fast, making quick assessments, moving on. Most of the time it worked. Most of the time the fast assessment was accurate enough to be useful, and the moving on kept things from stalling. The problem with a method that works most of the time is that you stop examining it, and then one day it doesn't work, and you've lost the habit of questioning it. $899. She had laughed. She opened her email and wrote a note to Patricia in records asking for the complete file on Ethan Mercer's engagement with the Helix program. Then she sent a second note to her assistant asking Marcus to be available for a meeting at 4 o'clock. Then she opened the Geneva preparation documents and got back to work, because the car was running and they had 9 days, and the feelings she was sitting with were real, but they were not the priority. Marcus arrived at her office at 4 with a yellow legal pad and a pen, which she noticed because Marcus didn't normally bring a legal pad to internal meetings. He brought tablets, laptops, printed agendas. A legal pad was old-fashioned. It was the kind of thing you brought when you expected to need to write things down that you didn't want on a device. She noticed it and said nothing about it, and gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat down. He put the legal pad on his knee with the pen uncapped, ready. "I want to understand February 14th, she said. He looked at the pad. The firmware update was a calibration optimization for the aerodynamics response curve at high speeds. The vehicle was performing within spec, but there was a range, roughly between 140 and 160 miles per hour, where the response felt slightly delayed. Not outside tolerances, but below what I thought we should be delivering. At that speed range, yes. In a car that's going to be driven on public roads. The buyers aren't purchasing it for track use only. That's..." She stopped. Started again. "That's not actually the issue, Marcus." He looked up from the pad. "The issue is that you made a unilateral decision to push an update to a system with over 1,200 integration points without running it through the protocol that exists specifically to prevent exactly what happened." She kept her voice even. Even was harder than it sounded right now. "You bypassed a process that cost this company almost $250,000 to develop, and that every member of the engineering team is trained to follow. I've approved updates at that level before. Not at this stage of the development cycle. Pre-shipping, Marcus, we were 2 weeks from shipping. I judged it to be within my decision authority." "Then your judgment was wrong." He put the pen down on the legal pad. "The update itself was technically sound. The conflict wasn't caused by the update in isolation. It was caused by an interaction between the update and an existing calibration state in the ECU that nobody had flagged. Which is exactly why the integration test protocol exists." "I know that." "Do you?" The question sat between them. He didn't answer it, which meant he understood it wasn't really a question about his technical knowledge. She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me about you and Ethan Mercer." He looked at the wall for a moment, then he looked back at her, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't expected. Not defensiveness, which was what she'd been braced for, but something more tired, more honest. "We were both at a company called Kinetics Engineering about 14 years ago," he said. "Small outfit, advanced powertrain development. Ethan was the lead on a fuel injection control system we were developing for a military contract. I was his project manager. And there was a design decision, a significant one, about the control algorithm. Ethan wanted to go one direction, I pushed for another. The direction I pushed for had a shorter development timeline, which mattered because we were approaching a contract deadline. The direction Ethan wanted was more complex, but he believed it was more robust over time." "Who was right?" Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds. "He was." She waited. "The system we built was within spec and passed all testing, but 18 months after delivery, one of the units failed in a way that Ethan had specifically predicted in a memo he wrote before we finalized the design. Nobody was hurt. The contract wasn't canceled, but the failure was documented, and there was an internal review, and in the review the memo surfaced." "The memo where he'd warned you?" "Yes." "What happened to him?" "The review was..." He picked up the pen, put it down again. "The review was managed. The company had reasons not to want the full picture public, because it involved a military contract and there were liability concerns. So the findings were internal and limited. Ethan didn't agree with how the review was conducted. He filed a formal objection, which created a situation that became untenable for him professionally. He left the company. He spent some time outside the industry." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Did you manage the review?" "I contributed to its scope." "Marcus, I was protecting the company. You were protecting yourself." He didn't deny it, The fact that he didn't deny it was the most honest thing that had happened in this office in a long time. She thought about the personnel file upstairs. 18 months of Ethan's work, paperclipped to a page in a binder that nobody had looked at in years. She thought about the shop in Mesa with the faded letters and the 4 parking spaces. When I asked you who could help with the Prometheus, she said, you gave me his name. I thought his name might come up regardless, through other channels. I wanted to be the one who surfaced it, while omitting everything that would have told me why his name was worth something. I thought if you knew about the history, you'd... He stopped. What? That you'd draw conclusions about my judgment. I am drawing conclusions about your judgment, Marcus. I'm drawing them right now, and I've been drawing them for the last 9 days. She stood up because sitting still had become difficult, and she needed to move. She walked to the window. Outside, the campus was quiet in the late afternoon light, the connecting walkways casting long shadows across the white concrete. You let this car sit broken for 17 days because you didn't want to bring in someone who might make you look bad. And then when the situation forced you to bring him in, you spent 5 minutes of our first meeting trying to make him feel small enough to leave. She turned back. That's what happened, Marcus. That's what I'm dealing with. He sat very straight in the chair. He was holding the pen without writing anything. His face was controlled in the way that faces get controlled when the effort of control is itself visible. I understand, he said. I'm going to need the complete record of the February 14th update. Every communication about it, every document, every log. I'm going to have engineering and legal review the full scope of what the integration test protocol requires at pre-shipping stage and whether what you did was within your documented authority. Yes. That review will take some time. While it's ongoing, I need you to continue your responsibilities in Geneva Prep. I need the launch to go smoothly. We're 9 days out, and I need your head in that, not in this. He looked at her. You're asking me to keep working. I'm telling you what I need. We can talk about everything else after Geneva. He stood. He picked up the legal pad. He'd written nothing on it. At the door, he stopped. For what it's worth, he said without turning around. What he did today, finding that in 20 minutes, I couldn't have done that. I don't think anyone else in this building could have. I knew that when I saw the fault description. That's why his name came to me. She didn't say anything. He left. She stood at the window for a while and watched the shadows lengthen on the concrete and thought about the difference between respecting someone's capability and being willing to say so out loud, and how large that distance could get and how much it could cost. She had Ethan's check cut the next morning. $899, printed on a company check with the Sterling Performance Motors letterhead. She signed it herself, which she didn't normally do for checks under a certain amount. That was an administrative function, but this one she signed herself. She had it messengered to the shop in Mesa along with a handwritten note on her personal stationery. The note was short. She thanked him for his time and his work and his patience, and she said she hoped the diagnostic had been interesting, and she signed it with just her first name. She didn't know why she added the part about hoping it was interesting. It just seemed like the right thing to acknowledge. That what he'd done wasn't just a service transaction, but something more specific than that, something that required a different kind of attention than ordinary work. 2 days passed. She heard nothing from him, which was what she expected. On the 3rd day, she called him. He picked up on the 2nd ring. The check arrived, he said, before she could state the reason for the call. Good. I'm not calling about the check. She was in her car, parked in the Sterling lot, which was where she often made calls she needed privacy for. I want to ask you something and you can say no. Okay. The Geneva exhibition is in 7 days. The Prometheus will be the centerpiece. I'd like you to be there. Silence. Not in any official capacity. Not to give a presentation or talk to press or do anything formal. Just there. She realized she was having trouble articulating what she actually meant, which was unusual for her. The car works because of you. The foundation of that engine is work you did 18 months of your life. And you're going to be in Mesa while we're in Geneva showing it to the world, and that seems wrong to me. Victoria. He said her name with a kind of careful gentleness that was different from how he'd said anything else to her, and it stopped her. I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't want to be in Geneva. He wasn't cold about it. He wasn't curt. I'm not being difficult. I genuinely don't want it. What I do, it doesn't require a room full of people seeing me do it. If the car works, the car works. That's the thing. She sat with that for a moment. I'm going to have to tell people what happened, she said. Not everything, but the board will need to know why we spent $200,000 and still had to bring in someone external. And the engineering team already knows. It's going to get around. Probably. I want to handle it accurately, which means I want your permission to tell people what your role was in the Helix program, in the diagnostic. You don't need my permission for that. I know I don't legally. I'm asking because it's the right thing to ask. A pause. Longer this time. She heard something in the background, a ratchet, maybe, or something being set down on a metal surface. Tell it accurately, he said. That's all I'd ask. I will. And if you're asking whether I mind people knowing I was on the Helix team, no, I don't mind. That was good work. I'm not ashamed of it. You shouldn't be. I'm not. He said it simply. I was for a while, a long time actually, but I'm not anymore. She didn't ask him to explain that. She thought she understood it well enough. Thank you, she said. Sure. Good luck in Geneva. She sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after she hung up, listening to the ambient sound of the campus. A delivery truck somewhere on the far side of the lot, the distant hum of the HVAC system on the administration building. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that was functioning again. The internal investigation began the following Monday, 4 days before Geneva. She had asked Margaret Cho to oversee it alongside the company's head of HR, a careful woman named Sandra Reeves, who had the rare quality of being able to conduct difficult processes without appearing to enjoy them, which was a quality Victoria valued highly in people who wielded institutional authority. They would review the complete record of the February 14th update, Marcus's decision log for the preceding 6 months, and any communications relating to the integration test protocol. Marcus complied fully. He submitted everything they requested by the end of the first day. That compliance was itself data. It said he understood the situation and had decided that resistance would make it worse. Daniel Okafor told Victoria in a brief conversation on Tuesday morning that he had known something was off about the February update when it was applied, but had said nothing because it hadn't thrown any flags at the time and Marcus had approved it. Why didn't you flag it? She asked. Daniel looked at the surface of the conference table. Marcus doesn't love being questioned on technical decisions. I see. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed, but it's useful information. She filed it alongside the other things she was accumulating in the part of her mind where she kept the harder lessons, the things she needed to sit with long enough to actually change, not just note and move past. On Wednesday, with 2 days remaining before they left for Geneva, Sandra Reeves came to her office with a summary of preliminary findings. The review had confirmed that the February 14th update had bypassed 2 stages of the integration test protocol that were specifically required for firmware changes affecting multiple interconnected systems at the pre-shipping stage. There was documentation, emails between Marcus and 2 junior engineers, that indicated he had been aware of the protocol requirements and had judged the update low risk enough to proceed without them. There was also a secondary finding. Sandra set it on her desk as a separate document. This came up in the email review. It's not directly related to the firmware question. Victoria looked at it. It was a thread of emails spanning about 3 months between Marcus and the Stuttgart consultant that Marcus had brought in. The first external expert, the one who'd charged $19,000 and produced the 40-page report. The thread predated the Prometheus failure. It had begun, based on the timestamps, approximately 6 weeks after the February 14th firmware update. She read it slowly. The emails were professional and oblique in the way that professional emails about sensitive subjects tend to be. Marcus had been in communication with the Stuttgart firm about what he described as a prospective engagement, not the Prometheus specifically, but the general category of problems the firm specialized in. He had provided enough technical description of the diagnostic challenge to make the nature of the engagement clear in retrospect. He had been setting up the Stuttgart consultant before the failure was discovered. before the car had even been tested for shipping. She sat very still. He had known, or strongly suspected, that the February update had created a problem. And rather than disclose it internally, he had quietly identified an external consultant who could be positioned as the solution when the problem surfaced. A solution that would come through him, managed by him, that would make the problem look like a systemic complexity rather than a specific decision made by a specific person. When she looked up from the document, Sandra was watching her carefully. "When did this thread end?" Victoria asked. 3 days before Mercer's diagnostic. Marcus apparently stopped communicating with the Stuttgart firm after Mercer identified the source. Because Mercer found it before the Stuttgart firm could manage it. That would be the inference. Victoria set the document down. She had spent 20 years in the automotive industry, which was not a gentle industry, and she had encountered most varieties of institutional self-protection. She understood how people behaved when they were scared, and how that behavior nested inside ordinary professional conduct in ways that were invisible until they weren't. But this was different in degree from most of what she'd seen. "Thank you, Sandra," she said. "Hold this. I'll need the full report when we're back from Geneva." Sandra gathered the documents. At the door she paused, which was unusual. Sandra was not a pauser. "Are you all right?" Victoria looked at her. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in 10 days. Geneva in early spring had a particular quality of light that Victoria had always found clarifying. Something about the lake and the mountains and the particular way the clouds moved through the Alps. It had the effect of making her feel like she could see things in better resolution than usual. She had been here 7 times in her career for various exhibitions and conferences, and every time, that effect was there. This time it wasn't. She was in the city, and she could see the lake from her hotel window, and the light was doing exactly what it always did. And she was thinking about Marcus on the flight over, thinking about the Stuttgart email thread, thinking about the way he had stood in the showroom after the Prometheus started and looked at the floor. The Sterling booth at the exhibition was the largest they'd ever taken. The Prometheus occupied a central platform, surrounded by a ring of subtle display lighting and a curved backdrop made of carbon fiber panels that echoed the car's bodywork. The presentation was staged for maximum visual impact. They had worked on it for months, hired a Paris-based exhibition designer, done 3 run-throughs before the event. When the space came together the morning before opening, even Victoria, in the state she was in, had to acknowledge that it was genuinely beautiful. The opening night reception drew 240 guests. Collectors, journalists, industry figures, a couple of racing drivers, the kind of crowd that could afford to think seriously about a $5 million vehicle. Victoria worked the room for 3 hours in a way that was professional and present, and required approximately 60% of her attention, while the other 40% was somewhere else entirely. She spoke to 7 potential buyers. She gave 2 brief on-camera interviews, one to an Italian automotive magazine and one to a German broadcaster. She answered questions about the Prometheus's performance specifications, its aerodynamic system, its production timeline, with the fluency of someone who had prepared for all of these questions and had answered versions of them many times before. At one point, near the end of the evening, a journalist from a French outlet, a young woman with a recorder and a slightly adversarial manner that Victoria recognized as the manner of someone who had been told to come back with something interesting, asked her what the most difficult part of bringing the Prometheus to market had been. Victoria considered the expected answers, the engineering complexity, the regulatory requirements in multiple markets, the supply chain challenges, the timeline pressure. "Knowing when to listen," she said. The journalist tilted her head slightly. "Can you be more specific?" At some point in a project this complex, you have to stop trusting the process and start trusting specific people. Getting those 2 things in the right order is harder than it sounds. The journalist wrote something. "Is there a specific person you're thinking of?" Victoria smiled. "Several. Oh, Marcus kept his distance in Geneva. He was present, professional, competent in the ways that mattered for the exhibition. He answered technical questions from journalists with precision, managed the logistics of the live performance demonstration on the second day without a visible problem, and interfaced with the other executives from Sterling without apparent strain. But he and Victoria moved through the 4 days like two people who were very skilled at being in the same room without being near each other. Their conversations were functional and brief. He would update her on a logistics item. She would confirm a decision. They would part. It was the behavior of two people who had a larger conversation waiting and had agreed without saying so to hold it until they were home. The demonstration on the second day was the moment the Prometheus actually spoke. They took it onto a closed section of road outside the city, a stretch arranged through a partnership with the Swiss government that had taken 4 months to negotiate and required more paperwork than the car itself had. 6 journalists were there, 3 cameras, a timing system. The demonstration driver was a former Formula E competitor named Soren Vidal, who had the particular quality of being able to communicate what a car was doing through his body language in ways that cameras picked up instinctively. Soren drove it twice. The first run was controlled, demonstrating the acceleration and handling envelope. The second run was faster than the first and ended with him sitting in the car for about 20 seconds after he stopped before he opened the door. When he got out, he was smiling in the involuntary way that meant the smile had nothing to do with anyone watching. "Tell me I can buy this," he said to Victoria. "You'll need to check the waiting list." "How long?" 3 years. "I'll wait," he said, still smiling. She watched the car being loaded back into its transport container, and she thought about Ethan Mercer in his shop in Mesa, and about what it would have felt like to be him, to have helped build the thing that made Soren Vidal smile without meaning to, and to be the only person in any room who knew it, or almost. On the last night, after the exhibition had closed and the team had gone to dinner without her because she'd said she had calls to make, which was partially true, she sat in her hotel room with the lights low and the lake visible through the window, going dark blue in the early evening, and she looked at her phone for a long time before she called him. He picked up on the third ring. There was background noise, something mechanical, not intrusive. "Prometheus did well," she said. A pause. "I heard. The Formula E guy." "You saw the coverage?" "Read it." She leaned back. "It should have been designed for more than 140 to 160, she said. "The aerodynamics adjustment, I mean. Whatever Marcus was trying to optimize for. There wasn't a reason to be that aggressive that close to shipping." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "there wasn't." He was fixing a problem he'd caused without anyone finding out he'd caused it. "That's my read." "And you knew that when you found the fault." He didn't answer immediately. "I had a strong suspicion," he said. "The nature of the conflict, where it was, when the update was logged, it pointed in one direction pretty clearly." "Why didn't you say so in the showroom?" "Because it wasn't my place to make that call in front of his team. That's your company. That's your call to make." She looked at the lake. "You've been doing this a long time. Not just diagnostics. Watching people manage their mistakes. Long enough. Does it get easier to watch?" He took a beat. "No," he said. "Not really. You just get better at knowing when it's yours to fix and when it isn't." She thought about that. She thought about the check she'd signed, about the note she'd written, about the arc of the past 3 weeks and everything it had cost and everything it had clarified. "I'm going to make some changes when I get back," she said. "I figured. The company's going to look a little different." "Probably good," he said, without elaborating. She smiled, which surprised her a little. "Thank you for picking up." "Sure." She hung up and sat in the quiet hotel room and listened to the sounds of Geneva outside, and the thing she felt was not quite relief and not quite resolution, but something in the neighborhood of both. The particular feeling of a person who has started to understand something and knows there's more understanding coming, and is, for the first time in a few weeks, okay with that. She came back from Geneva on a Thursday. The flight was 11 hours and she slept for 3 of them, which was better than she usually managed on transatlantic returns. She spent 2 hours reviewing the board presentation she'd need to deliver within the week. A summary of the Geneva exhibition results, the Prometheus reception, the preliminary buyer interest generated by the event. The numbers were good. Better than projected, actually. The demonstration with Soren Vidal had generated coverage in 14 countries and produced 6 new buyer inquiries from qualified prospects who had not previously been in contact with Sterling. Two of them were at the level of serious conversation. She kept the good numbers in one part of her mind and the rest of it in another. Her driver met her at the airport, and they took the highway back to Scottsdale in the early morning, the desert pink and flat in the pre-dawn light, the kind of sky that looked painted and wasn't. She watched it through the window and felt the accumulated weight of 3 weeks settling on her, the way travel weight always did. Not tiredness exactly, but a recalibration, the body and mind both catching up to what had happened. She was in the office by 9. Her assistant, a young man named Kevin, who had the rare quality of understanding which problems she needed to know about immediately and which ones could wait, had a single note waiting on her desk. Sandra Reeves had asked to meet at 10. She had the report. Sandra came in at exactly 10, with Margaret Cho beside her, and they sat across from Victoria with the particular composed solemnity of people who had spent time with difficult information and had learned how to carry it without letting it show in their posture. The full report was 43 pages. Sandra walked her through the key findings in 20 minutes, efficiently and without editorializing, which Victoria appreciated. The facts were sufficiently editorial on their own. The February 14th update had bypassed 2 mandatory protocol stages. This was documented and unambiguous. Marcus's email record confirmed he had been aware of the protocol requirements and had made an explicit judgment that they were unnecessary for this update. That judgment had been made alone, without consultation, without documentation of his reasoning in the project management system, and without notification to Daniel Okafor or any other senior engineer. That was the baseline finding. It was serious. What came next was worse. The Stuttgart consultant thread was in the report, fully analyzed. Margaret had brought in a forensic communications specialist to map the timeline precisely. The first contact between Marcus and the Stuttgart firm had occurred 19 days after the February 14th update, before any failure had been detected, before any testing had been run, before the Prometheus had been placed on the shipping preparation checklist. The communications in that period were, as Margaret put it, exploratory in a way that suggests awareness of a potential problem rather than general networking. Marcus had known. He had known at some level, not necessarily the precise technical nature of the failure, but that something was wrong, that the update he'd pushed without testing had the potential to produce consequences he couldn't predict and couldn't control. And rather than disclose this to the engineering team and walk back the decision, he had begun quietly building a management structure around it. There was more. In the 3 weeks between the initial failure and Ethan's diagnostic, Marcus had communicated with the Stuttgart consultant 8 additional times. In 2 of those communications, he had provided technical descriptions of the fault behavior that were specific enough that Sandra's specialist concluded he understood more about the nature of the problem than he had ever indicated to Victoria or to the engineering team. He had described the fault as, in his own words, a firmware integration issue of unknown origin. Unknown. The word was precise enough to be intentional. He had also, in the same period, accessed the personnel archive on the Sterling internal system. The access log showed he had pulled the Helix program files twice, once in the first week of the failure, once 3 days before the diagnostic. He looked up the Helix files, Victoria said. Yes, Sandra said. After the failure started. Yes, Victoria sat back. He knew Ethan's name was in there. He knew what Ethan had worked on. He accessed the files while deciding how to manage the situation. The access timestamps are consistent with that interpretation, Margaret said. We can document the access. We can't document the intent. But the sequence speaks for itself. In my professional opinion, Margaret said, yes. Victoria looked at the report on the desk in front of her without reading it. The lake in Geneva, the way Marcus had stood with his arms at his sides after the car started, the legal pad on his knee with nothing written on it. He's been here 12 years, she said. Yes, Sandra said. She said it neutrally, which was the right call. He's been CTO for 8 of those. Yes, and he's good at the job, when the job is the job and not this. Neither Sandra nor Margaret responded to that, which was also the right call. Victoria picked up the report and set it down again. I want to give him the chance to respond to the findings before I make any decision. That's the process. Of course. Can we do that this week? His calendar is clear Friday afternoon. Friday, she said. Tell him it's a follow-up to the internal review. Don't tell him the scope of what we found. I want to see what he brings to the conversation when he doesn't know what we know. She wasn't proud of that instinct, but she also wasn't pretending she didn't have it. In the 3 days between Geneva and Friday, Victoria did something she hadn't done in a long time. She went back through her own decisions, not in the performative way of a quarterly review, where you noted what worked and what didn't in a structured format designed to produce actionable takeaways. She went back through them the uncomfortable way, the way you do it alone, in your own head, when nobody's keeping score, the way that doesn't produce anything you can put in a presentation. She thought about the day Ethan had walked in, the way she had filed him before he'd said more than his name. She had done it automatically, the way she did everything automatically after 2 decades of running fast, and she had done it wrong. She had looked at the shop name on his shirt and the bag over his shoulder and the way he hadn't pressed her hand or made eye contact with half the room or done any of the things people do when they want to be recognized, and she had put him in a box that the situation did not fit. She thought about the laugh. It was a short thought because there wasn't much to examine. She had laughed. Everyone in the room had heard it. He had heard it. The laugh had communicated something she hadn't meant to communicate, which was, I've already decided what you are. She had been wrong, and the wrongness had cost the company money and cost her credibility and cost a man 3 weeks of being underestimated in his own professional discipline. You couldn't put a dollar figure on that last one, but it wasn't 0. She thought about Marcus, about the 12 years, about the competence that was real and the fear that was real, and the way those 2 things had combined in the pressure of a specific situation into something she was now sitting across from with a 43-page report. She thought about the kind of leader she had believed herself to be, and the kind she apparently was when the test was actual. There was a gap there. It wasn't enormous. She'd done enough things right over the years to know the gap wasn't enormous, but it was real and it had real edges, and she was going to have to decide what to do with it. On Thursday evening, she drove to Mesa. She hadn't called ahead. She was aware, pulling into the parking lot of the shop, that arriving unannounced was a choice that she hadn't entirely examined the reasons for. But she was here, and the light in one of the bays was on, which meant he was working. She parked and went in through the open bay. He was at a workbench against the far wall, not under a car this time, working on something small, a component of some kind, disassembled into pieces that were laid out on a cloth with the organization of someone who would know exactly how to reassemble them in the dark. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the concrete. He didn't look surprised. He looked the way he usually looked, present, steady, mildly curious. "Didn't call," he said. "I know. I was driving." She looked around the bay. There was a Maserati in the far stall with its hood up, a rack of tools along the wall, organized in a way that looked intuitive rather than decorative. A coffee maker on a small table near the door that had clearly been used many times and cleaned many fewer times. "Were you at a company before Kinetics, before the Helix program?" He looked at her for a moment, gauging the nature of the question. "2 companies, one in Detroit, one in California." "Why?" "I've been going through your history, professionally. I want to understand it better." "The personnel file." "Beyond the personnel file. I pulled some industry records, some patent filings. The Helix engine architecture has 7 patents attached to it. You're listed as a primary inventor on 4 of them." He went back to the component on the workbench, picked up a small tool. "That's correct?" 4 patents on the foundational architecture of the engine that powers the Prometheus, which is a $5 million vehicle. She watched him work. "And you're in Mesa charging $8.99 for diagnostics." "Sometimes less," he said. "Depends on the job." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." He set the tool down and looked at her. "What is it you're actually asking?" She leaned against the doorframe of the bay. "I'm trying to understand the decision, to be here instead of somewhere else." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the component he'd been working on, examined it, set it down again. "After Kinetics," he said, "I spent about 2 years not really doing anything. I had some money saved. I lived cheaply. I read a lot. I did some consulting work here and there, Nothing significant. I was trying to figure out what had gone wrong and whether it was a me problem or a situation problem. And for a long time, I wasn't sure. What did you decide? Bit of both, he said. The situation was real. What Marcus did was real. The way the review got managed was real. But I'd spent a lot of energy in those years trying to prove something to people who weren't going to be convinced. That takes something out of you. You end up distorting your own work because it's pointed at the wrong thing. At being recognized. At winning an argument that had already been decided. He picked up the tool again. When I came back to it, I came back differently. I wanted the work to be the thing, not what the work said about me. The shop was a way to do that. Victoria looked at the Maserati with its hood up. You don't miss it? The larger scale of things? He almost smiled. I get large-scale problems all the time. I just don't have to sit in budget meetings about them. She was quiet for a moment. I came to tell you something, she said. The investigation is concluding. I'm meeting with Marcus on Friday. He looked at her. I want you to know the outcome will be what the evidence requires, not what's comfortable. She paused. And I want you to know that what I found in the archive, your work on the Helix program, is going to be part of the formal record of how the Prometheus was developed. The patent filings are already public, but the contribution isn't documented in the company's own history of the project. I'm changing that. He was still watching her. His expression was hard to read, which was normal for him, but there was something in it that wasn't quite composure, something slightly less settled than the usual. You don't have to do that, he said. I want to. Why? She thought about how to answer honestly. Because accuracy matters. Because I spent 3 weeks operating on inaccurate information, partly because of circumstances and partly because of my own assumptions, and the cost of that was real. Getting the record right is a small thing, but it's what I have. He looked at the workbench, at the component and pieces on the cloth, at something past the workbench. I appreciate that, he said, finally, carefully. The check arrived? You already asked me that. I know, I'm nervous. The admission surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She didn't make admissions like that reflexively, didn't lead with her own uncertainty. But it was accurate, so she let it stand. I'm not used to situations where I'm still catching up on what I owe. He looked at her for a moment. You don't owe me anything. You paid for the diagnostic. I laughed at you. You did. In front of my team. Also correct. And you left, and I didn't call you back for 4 days. 5, actually, but I wasn't counting. The slightly dry edge on that last sentence was the closest thing to humor she'd heard from him in 3 weeks of intermittent conversation, and it loosened something in the room. 5, she repeated. I'm sorry. I know, he said. You already told me. I'm telling you again. He picked up the component and looked at it. Apology received, both times. She pushed off the doorframe. I'll let you work. You don't have to leave. She stopped. It's not. He set the component down, which seemed to cost him something, a small abandonment of the task that served as armor. If you want to stay and talk, you can stay and talk. I'm not in a rush. She looked at him. He looked back. It was a different kind of looking than the looking they'd done in the Sterling showroom or in the parking lot of this shop 2 weeks ago, or on the phone from Geneva. Those had all been professional looks, the kind that carried information. This one was simpler and didn't carry anything except the admission that they were 2 people in a bay in Mesa at 8 o'clock in the evening, and neither of them was in a particular hurry to be somewhere else. She pulled a stool from under the workbench and sat down. What is that thing? She said, nodding at the component. Throttle body from a 1991 Ferrari 348. The original owner replaced it with an aftermarket unit in the 90s, and now the current owner wants it back to factory spec. Is that complicated? Not mechanically. Getting the original part was the hard part. Where do you find a 30-year-old throttle body? Same place you find everything. You know who to call. She watched him work for a while. He had a specific quality of attention that she'd noticed the first time she saw him in the Sterling showroom, but hadn't been able to name then. She could name it now. He was completely in the thing he was doing. Not performing concentration, not managing the fact of being observed, just in it. She said, "Can I ask you something about the Helix program?" "Sure." "The engine architecture you built, how much of what we're seeing in the Prometheus is your original design?" He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, but thinking accurately. "The core displacement cycle, the firing order, the way the turbocharger intercooling is staged, that's foundational, and it's still there. The compression ratios changed. The fuel delivery system was redesigned. The software stack is completely different, obviously. But the skeleton, the thing that makes it sound like it sounds and pull like it pulls, that's from the Helix work. From you. From the team. There were 4 other people, genuinely good engineers. But you led the powertrain integration." "Yes." "So when Soren Vidal sat in the car after his second run and didn't get out for 20 seconds, he looked up from the throttle body." "That was partially you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression that was real and wasn't pride exactly, more like recognition. The way someone looks when something they did a long time ago, that they'd stopped thinking about, suddenly comes back into focus. "Partially," he said. She nodded. She didn't push it further. Some things landed better without being elaborated. On. Friday came with the particular flatness of days that have important things scheduled for the afternoon. Victoria spent the morning on the board presentation. She was meeting with the board the following Tuesday, and the Geneva results were the primary agenda item, but the investigation findings would need to be disclosed in the same meeting. She was working on how to sequence them, how to present the good and the bad in a way that was honest without being structurally undermining. It was a communication problem, and communication problems were something she was usually competent at. Today, it was taking longer than usual. At 2 o'clock, she put the presentation aside and asked Kevin to send Marcus in. He came in promptly, which was also data. People who are guilty of something and know a reckoning is coming are often either early or late, rarely on time. Marcus was on time to the minute, and he sat down across from her desk in the same chair as before and did not bring the legal pad this time. She placed the executive summary of the report on the desk and slid it across to him. He looked at it without picking it up. "The full report is 43 pages, she said. "I'll give you the full copy after this meeting. The summary covers the key findings." He picked it up. He read it. He was a fast reader, and she watched his face while he read and saw the moment he reached the Stuttgart section, because his expression changed. Not dramatically, but the particular controlled composure he maintained shifted slightly, tightened. He set the summary down. "I want to hear from you," she said. "I've seen what the record shows. I want to hear what the record doesn't show." He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on his knees. "There isn't much the record doesn't show," he said. "You've been thorough. Tell me about February 14th. In your own words, start from what you were thinking when you approved the update." He looked at the window, not at her. The car was performing within spec, technically within spec, but I knew in the way you know things when you've spent 8 years on a product, that there was something slightly off in the high-speed aero response. Not dangerous. Not even necessarily perceptible to most drivers. But I knew it was there. And I knew that if any of the press drivers felt it at Geneva, there would be language about it. Not quite as crisp as you'd expect at 150. That kind of language. "So you fixed it." "I tried to fix it. Without telling anyone. It was a calibration adjustment. Calibration adjustments at that level. Marcus." He stopped. "I've read the protocol documents. The relevant section is not ambiguous. Firmware updates affecting multiple integrated systems at pre-shipping stage require integration testing and sign-off from at least 2 senior engineers. That section exists because we put it in after the 2019 production incident, which you were present for." "I know." "So why?" He looked at his hands. "Because if I flagged it through the protocol, it would surface the question of why I hadn't caught it earlier. The calibration issue was a consequence of a decision I'd made in the system architecture 6 months before. If I ran the formal process, someone was going to trace it back." The room was very quiet. "And when the update created the problem," she said, "you built a containment structure around it. You were trying to keep control of the narrative." He didn't deny it. He looked at his hands and didn't deny it. and that was its own kind of statement. She leaned forward. You accessed the Helix archive after the failure started. He looked up. Twice. The access log is in the report. He was quiet. You knew Ethan's background. You'd known it since before I ever asked you for names. When the failure started, you went back to those files. Not to understand the technical problem, but to assess the situation. To understand who might be able to trace what had happened and where they would look. Victoria, Scott. Is that accurate? He held her gaze. Yes, he said. That's accurate. It was the first thing he'd said in the conversation that was fully direct, fully unequivocal, fully stripped of the professional obliqueness that everything else had been wrapped in. She noticed it. She held it. She thought about the 12 years. I need to ask you something else, she said, and I need you to answer it without calculating what the answer costs you. Just answer it. He waited. If Marcus Hale had not been in that showroom, if it had been someone else standing there when Ethan said his rate, would the car have gotten fixed 3 weeks earlier? The question sat in the air between them. He answered it slowly. Probably, he said. Probably yes. She sat back. She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she'd looked at across tables and conference rooms for 12 years, the face that had been on the other end of 100 difficult decisions and 100 conversations about the future of this company. She was not dispassionate about it. That was the honest thing. She was not dispassionate, and being a professional did not require pretending she was. I'm going to need your resignation, she said. He didn't move. The board meets Tuesday. I'd like to have it before then. He looked at the surface of her desk. He was doing the thing people do when they're deciding whether to fight. Not with anger, but with the careful assessment of someone who is determining whether there's any version of the next move that changes the outcome. She could see him doing it, and she waited, because she had learned a long time ago that it was important to give people the space to decide things for themselves, even when the decision was already made. The Stuttgart communications, he said finally. If I'd disclosed the problem when I understood it, we'd be having a different conversation, she said. We might still be having a hard conversation, but a different one. Yes. But we're not. He nodded slowly. He put his hands on the arms of the chair. I'll have the resignation letter to you by end of day, he said. Thank you. He stood. He straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of someone who was always well-dressed and couldn't turn it off even when everything else was coming apart. He looked at her. The car is going to do well, he said. The exhibition, the reception. You'll sell every unit in the first run. I know. Whatever else this is, he said, the car is good. It is. She held his gaze. I hope you know I mean it when I say that 12 years of good work is real. It doesn't change this, but it's real. He held her gaze for one more moment, then nodded once and left. She sat in the office after the door closed and did not do anything for about 4 minutes. She did not read the report. She did not look at her email. She did not reach for the board presentation. She just sat, because this was one of those moments that required being present in it, rather than immediately converting it into the next task. Then she picked up her phone and called Daniel Okafor. He picked up on the first ring. I need you in my office at 4, she said. I have something to tell you about the CTO role. A pause. Okay? It's not bad news, she said. Not for you. Another pause, longer, carrying the particular quality of someone recalibrating quickly. I'll be there at 4, he said. Mutort. The resignation letter arrived at 4:47 by email with no subject line. It was 3 sentences. Professional, clean, with the date of effect being the following Monday. She read it twice, forwarded it to Margaret and Sandra, and filed it. Daniel Okafor took the news of the acting CTO appointment with a controlled expression that lasted approximately 6 seconds before becoming something more genuine. He had questions, and she answered them, and they talked for an hour about the transition and the ongoing projects and the Geneva follow-up and the 11 units in the production run. He was thorough and careful and asked the right things in the right order, and she thought about Marcus saying once, years ago, that Daniel was a strong engineer but didn't have the executive instinct. She had believed him at the time. She wasn't sure what she'd been believing exactly. After Daniel left, she sat at her desk in the early evening light, The campus going quiet outside, the desert beyond the glass turning amber and then gold, and then that deep, irreproducible orange of the Arizona evening, and she looked at her phone. She needed to call the board chair before Tuesday. She needed to revise the presentation. She needed to think through the public communications around the CTO transition. There were a dozen things that needed her attention in the next 72 hours, real and substantial things with real and substantial consequences. She did none of them for a few minutes. She just sat and looked at the light on the desert and thought about what it costs to know something and not say it, and what it costs to look at something too fast and file it wrong, and what the difference was between the two. One was self-protection. One was carelessness. Both left damage. Both required the same thing afterward, not just fixing what was broken, but being willing to look at how it broke in the first place. The phone rang. It was Kevin, asking if she needed anything before he left for the day. "No," she said. "Go home. Tell whoever you're going home to that they're getting you at a reasonable hour for once." He laughed a little. He always laughed at her attempts at being warm, which were genuine but somewhat approximate. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night," she said. The campus went quiet. The light went gold. Somewhere out in Mesa, a man she had laughed at was probably still working or had closed the shop and gone home to whatever his evenings looked like, unaware or unconcerned that the company whose most important vehicle ran on the back of his best work was about to put his name into its permanent record. She thought he would be all right with that. She thought that was probably the right read. She hoped she was learning to read things right. The board meeting was on a Tuesday, and Victoria had not slept well the night before. Not because she was unprepared. She had been preparing for this meeting in some form since she stepped off the plane from Geneva, and the presentation was as solid as she could make it under the circumstances. She had the Geneva numbers, which were genuinely strong. She had the investigation findings, which were genuinely not. She had a transition plan for the CTO role, which was careful and defensible. She had answers ready for the questions the board would ask, including the questions they would ask sideways, through the language of fiduciary concern, which was the board's preferred dialect for expressing displeasure without committing to a position. What she didn't have was the ability to turn her brain off at 11 o'clock the night before a meeting where she was going to have to account, in some measure, for her own failures alongside everyone else's. That was the part that kept her awake. The investigation had produced a clear and documentable story about Marcus's conduct, and that story was true and complete, and she was prepared to tell it accurately. But accurate telling required context, and the context included her own behavior, and her own behavior included 30 seconds in a showroom that had cost this company significantly more than it needed to. She got up at 5 and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with the presentation open on her laptop and went through it one more time, not changing anything, just reading it the way you reread something when what you're actually doing is making peace with it. By 7, she was at the office. By 8, she was ready. The board convened at 9. There were 7 members. She knew all of them well. Some she'd worked with for over a decade. Some she'd recruited herself. One she actively found difficult and had learned to work with anyway because he asked the questions nobody else was willing to ask, which had its own value even when it was uncomfortable. They assembled in the main conference room on the 2nd floor, the one with the long oval table and the view of the campus, and beyond it, the desert. The desert, she had noticed over the years, had a stabilizing effect on difficult conversations. Something about the scale of it. She gave the Geneva presentation first, because the sequence mattered. Strong news before hard news wasn't spin. It was accuracy. The exhibition had been a genuine success, and that needed to be stated and understood before the complications were introduced, or the complications would color everything, including things they shouldn't color. The board received the Geneva results well. There were questions about the buyer pipeline, about production capacity for the expanded interest, about pricing strategy for the second production run. She answered them clearly. The room had the quality of a room that was warming up, people leaning in slightly, the defensive posture of board members who were always managing their exposure relaxing fractionally. Then she moved to the investigation. She gave it to them straight. The February 14th update, the protocol bypass, the Stuttgart thread, the access logs, the resignation. She used the same unembellished factual language that the report itself used, because she had found over the years that when you had to deliver information that reflected badly on your organization, the plainest telling was the most credible. Anything that sounded like managed narrative invited the question of what wasn't being managed as carefully. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The difficult board member, whose name was Gerald Foss, and who was a former aerospace executive with the particular quality of precision that came from decades in a field where imprecision cost lives, said, "Walk me through the timeline of when you first became aware of the fault and when you authorized external diagnostic assistance." She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "So there was a period of approximately 17 days between the initial failure and the correct diagnostic." "Yes." "During which the company spent approximately $230,000 on parts and consultation." $212,000 approximately. That's the current accounting. "And the correct diagnostic took one session and cost $899. "Yes." Foss looked at the table for a moment. "The Mercer diagnostic, how long did it take from the time he arrived to the time the car started?" "From his arrival to the engine starting was approximately 23 minutes. The room absorbed this. "And the delay in engaging him," Foss said, "was attributable to Hale's withholding of relevant background information, and also to your initial assessment of Mercer at the first meeting." Victoria had expected this question in some form. She had prepared for it in some form, but having prepared for it didn't make it less direct when it arrived. "Yes," she said, "both of those things contributed." "Tell me about your initial assessment." She told him. She told him about the showroom, about Ethan walking in, about the rate he'd quoted. She told him about the laugh, not defensively, not with the protective framing of context and pressure and the demands of the moment. She told it plainly. "I underestimated him," she said, "based on how he looked and where he worked, and a number I found surprising. That was wrong, and it compounded a situation that was already being mismanaged." Foss looked at her for a long moment. "How do we prevent this from happening again?" "That's partly a process question and partly a culture question," she said. "On the process side, I'm implementing a mandatory escalation protocol for any active system failures that persist beyond 48 hours without a documented root cause. External diagnostic authority becomes an option on that timeline, regardless of internal team confidence. On the culture side, that's harder to codify." She paused. "I'm working on it." He nodded once and wrote something, and the conversation moved to the other board members, who had their own questions, some practical and some more pointed. She answered all of them. By noon, when the meeting ended, she had a clear mandate to proceed with the leadership transition, a request for a 30-day progress report, and the particular feeling of someone who has walked through fire that was partly of their own making and come out the other side still standing. Not unburned, still standing. Gimel 10. In the days that followed the board meeting, the company moved through the transition with the slightly jerky momentum of an organization in motion that has had a wheel replaced while driving. Daniel Okafor stepped into the acting CTO role with visible effort and genuine capability, two things that don't always go together. He asked good questions in the first week and made one decision that Victoria disagreed with and told him so directly. And he took the feedback without deflecting, which told her more than the decision had. The engineering team, without Marcus in the building, behaved in a way that was subtly different from before. She noticed it in the tenor of meetings, in the way people contributed in rooms where Marcus had previously been present. It was hard to name precisely, but it had something to do with oxygen, like a window had been opened. She noticed other things, too. She noticed that Daniel's instinct on the second production run was more aggressive than Marcus would have pushed for, and probably right. She noticed that one of the junior engineers, a young woman named Priya, who had been on the Prometheus team from early on and had, Victoria now recalled, once tried to flag a concern about the integration test protocol in a team meeting and been talked past without acknowledgement, had ideas about the active aerodynamic system that were worth serious attention. She started paying attention. 2 weeks after the board meeting, she received a phone call from a man named Arthur Webb, who described himself as a former colleague of Ethan's from the kinetics engineering period. He was calling, he said, because he'd heard through industry channels that Sterling's Prometheus diagnostic had involved Ethan Mercer, and he wanted to express, he paused here, searching for the right word, his gladness at hearing Ethan was doing good work. Victoria listened to this carefully. "What was your connection to Ethan?" she asked. "I was on the Helix team with him. Junior engineer. He was the best technical mind I'd worked with up to that point, and honestly since." Another pause. "I heard about what happened at Kinetics. Most of us did. Eventually. I've always thought he got the wrong end of a situation that didn't have much to do with his work." "That's my understanding as well," she said. "I just wanted someone at Sterling to know what you had when you called him in." He sounded slightly embarrassed about the call itself, the way people do when they're doing something they feel compelled to do but didn't fully plan. "That probably sounds odd." "It doesn't," she said. "It sounds like someone who's been wanting to say something for a while." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose it does." After she hung up, she sat with the call for a few minutes. Arthur Webb, who had been a junior engineer on the team that built the core of what was now a $5 million vehicle, had called a CEO he'd never met to tell her that his old colleague was good at his job. The loyalty in that was real. The need to say it was real. She thought about what it cost to be Ethan Mercer for 14 years. The weight of good work that had been attributed wrong, or not attributed at all. The particular solitude of someone who had decided to make the work the point and had gotten very good at living with the fact that most people would never know what the work actually was. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, which she had come to understand was his pattern, never immediate, never delayed, always on the second ring, as if he heard the phone and gave himself exactly one ring to decide whether to pick up, and always decided yes. "Someone named Arthur Webb called me today," she said. A pause. "Arthur." The word carried something, warmth, and the particular register that names have when they belong to people you haven't spoken to in a long time. "How is he?" "He seemed well. He called to say good things about you." "That sounds like Arthur." "He was on the Helix team?" 2 years behind me. Smart kid. He was barely 25 when we were building the engine architecture." A pause. "I haven't talked to him in a long time." "I can give you his number if you want it." Another pause, longer. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that, actually." She gave it to him. Then she said, "The board meeting went well as those things go. I figured it would. The investigation findings are closed. Marcus's resignation is effective. Daniel Okafor is acting CTO." Okafor. A beat. "I met him briefly, the day of the diagnostic. He was the one who asked about the port." "That's him. He's sharp. He saw something in the methodology that took his colleagues longer to notice." She made a note of that, not literally, but in the way she was increasingly making notes about the things Ethan said that were assessments. His assessments tended to be accurate. "The board authorized me to proceed with the transition. I gave them an honest account of what happened." "Including the laugh." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't not a question. "Including the laugh," she said. "How'd that go?" "About how you'd expect. Gerald Foss asked me to explain my initial assessment of you, and I told him what it was." "Was that uncomfortable?" "Significantly." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Good," he said, and it didn't sound mean. It sounded like someone who thought discomfort at the right time was a sign of functioning correctly. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "Not on the phone. Can I come to the shop?" "When?" "Tomorrow, if that works." "I'm here by 7. She arrived at 7:15, which was earlier than she'd arrived anywhere in a long time that wasn't an airport. The shop was already open, one of the bay doors up, the lights on, the coffee maker running. He was at the bench with something that wasn't the Ferrari throttle body, something larger. He looked up when she came in and didn't seem surprised, which she was starting to understand was his default mode. He was very difficult to surprise. She sat on the same stool as before. "What is it?" he said. "I want to offer you a consulting arrangement," she said. "Formal, documented. A retainer, not a salary, not a staff position. I know you don't want that. A retainer that gives us access to your diagnostic capability on an ongoing basis and gives you complete independence about the nature and scope of your work. You keep the shop, you keep your other clients, you structure your time however you want. When we need you, we call, and the rate is whatever you say the rate is. He was looking at the component in his hands. The $8.99 question is already closed, she said. I'm not trying to compensate you retroactively for what the Prometheus problem actually cost. That ship has sailed, and you made your position on it clear. This is a different thing. This is about building a relationship with someone who can do something our internal team can't do, and doing it in a way that respects what you've told me you want. He set the component down. Why now? Because the board situation is resolved, and I can make commitments I can actually keep. 2 weeks ago, I was in the middle of a personnel transition and a board presentation, and I didn't want to bring you something I couldn't follow through on. He looked at her. That's a more careful answer than most executives would give. I've been trying to be more careful in general lately. He almost smiled at that. He picked up the component again and turned it over in his hands, a gesture she'd come to understand was not distraction, but thinking. He thought better with his hands doing something. What kind of problems are we talking about? Primarily diagnostics, complex fault behavior, integration problems, unusual failure patterns, things that fall outside the standard methodology. She paused. You'd have access to the full engineering team, the full documentation, all the technical records. Not just when something is broken, I'd want you able to look at systems proactively if you're willing. Proactively. Catch things before they become February 14th situations. He was quiet for a moment. That would require trust in both directions. I know. Your engineers would need to be comfortable with an external person having access to that level of documentation. Not all of them will be. Some of them won't be, she agreed. That's something I'd need to manage. I'm telling you what I want, not promising it'll be frictionless. At least you're honest about that. I'm trying. He set the component down again and looked at her directly. What's the rate? Whatever you say. That's not how negotiations work. It's not a negotiation, she said. I'm telling you I'll pay what you think it's worth. You've already demonstrated that you price things accurately and don't inflate based on leverage, so I'll trust your number. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding, not whether to trust her exactly, but whether the thing she was offering was actually what she said it was, and whether he was willing to find out. $3,000 a month retainer, he said. That covers availability and 1 diagnostic session per month. Anything beyond that, we negotiate per project. Yes. I need full access to the technical documentation on any vehicle I'm asked to work on. Not summaries, full records. I'll set up the access. And I don't work in the showroom. He said it plainly, without emphasis. Whatever space you set aside for diagnostic work, it needs to be a working space, not a performance. She thought about what he was actually saying with that. The engineers watch, she said, like before. The engineers can watch. That's different from it being a production. Understood. He picked up his coffee mug from the edge of the bench. It was a plain white mug, slightly chipped on the handle, the kind of mug that had been in service for years past the point where most people would have replaced it. He drank from it and looked out the open bay door at the street outside, where the morning was just getting started, a car passing, someone walking a dog, the ordinary machinery of a day that had nothing to do with hypercars or board meetings or the cost of underestimating people. Okay, he said. Okay? Yes. He set the mug down. I'll do it. She let out a breath she hadn't fully known she was holding. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Wait until the first time I find something your team missed and see how the room handles it. I'll talk to the team. Talk to them, but also let them experience it. People adapt to what they encounter, not to what they're told. She looked at him. You've managed people before. I've watched people be managed well and badly for a long time. You pick things up. She thought about the kinetics review, about 14 years of picking things up in a shop in Mesa instead of a corner office, about what got deposited in a person's understanding over that kind of time, whether they wanted it to or not. When can you come in? She said. I want to introduce you to Daniel formally. And to Priya, "There's a young engineer I think you should meet." "I can come Thursday." "Thursday." She stood from the stool. "I'll have Kevin set it up." He nodded. He was already reaching for the component he'd been working on, the conversation completed in his mind and the work reasserting its priority, and she recognized that as a version of something she did herself, the way real work called you back when the necessary conversation was over, neither rudely nor with ceremony. She was almost at the bay door when she stopped. "Ethan?" He looked up. "I've been thinking about something you said. The night I came here after Geneva, you said you came back to the work differently, that you wanted the work to be the thing." "Yeah. I'm trying to figure out how to do that, how to run this company in a way where the thing is the thing, where the car matters more than the story about the car." She paused. "I don't have a clean way to do that yet, but I'm trying to think it through." He looked at her for a moment. "You know the version of this company your grandfather started," he said. "One shop, one customer at a time. He knew what every engine he built was for and who was going to drive it. I know the stories. You can't get back to that at the scale you're operating. That's not what I mean." He tilted his head slightly. "But you can make sure the people at the center of the technical work feel like what they're doing matters to the person running the place, not as a resource, as the actual reason." She absorbed that. "How do you know about my grandfather's shop?" "The Helix program files. There was a company history document in the archive. I read it while I was on contract." He almost smiled again. "The 1971 drag engine. His first customer was a high school teacher from Tempe who saved up for 2 years. She did smile. "He kept a photo of that car on his desk until he died." "That's the version," Ethan said. "Not the scale. The reason." She stood in the bay door for a moment with the morning coming in around her, warm and bright the way Arizona mornings were in spring, before the heat arrived and made everything serious. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed, and went back to work. She drove back to Scottsdale on the highway with the windows down, which she almost never did because it messed her hair before the office. But this morning she drove with the windows down and the desert air coming in and thought about her grandfather's first customer, the high school teacher from Tempe, who had saved for 2 years for an engine that nobody but Leonard Sterling would build for him. She thought about what it meant to be the only person willing to do a specific thing, not the biggest or the flashiest or the most credentialed, just the one who could actually do it, and was willing to show up and do it for $899 because that was what the work cost and the work was the point. She had built this company on the inheritance of that ethic without, she was now understanding, ever having fully examined whether she still operated by it. You could inherit something and use it as a story about yourself without actually living inside it. That was a common enough failure. It was also a correctable one, if you were willing to look at it directly. Thursday came with its own weather, overcast, which was unusual for late spring in the valley, the cloud cover giving the light a diffuse quality that made everything look slightly cleaner than it was. Ethan arrived at the Sterling campus at 9 exactly, driving his own truck, an older model F-150 that looked like it had been maintained with the same philosophy as everything else in his professional life. Reliable, functional, no concessions to appearance. She met him at the entrance herself. He came through the door and looked at the lobby the way he'd looked at the Prometheus the first time, with attention, not performance. He registered the space and put it somewhere and moved on. "Daniel's in the engineering wing," she said. "He's looking forward to meeting you properly." "Properly," he said, with the slight irony of someone remembering the context of their first meeting. "The circumstances were unusual. That's one word for it." They walked through the connecting walkway to the engineering wing. The morning was quiet in the way mid-week mornings were on the campus, the serious industrial hum of work being done without the meeting density of Mondays or the end-of-week pressure of Fridays. Through the glass walls of the main engineering floor, she could see people at workstations, at whiteboards, hunched over laptops with the focused inward look of people solving problems. She watched Ethan watching them. "What do you see?" she said. He considered the question. "A lot of parallel work that isn't talking to each other," he said. "The guy at the second workstation on the left has been looking at the same screen for at least the last 3 minutes without moving. The woman at the whiteboard has written the same equation twice with different variable labels. He paused. They're both working on the same problem from different ends, and neither of them knows it. She looked at the same space. She saw the same two people and had no idea how he'd read any of that. How do you know they're working on the same problem? I don't, for certain, but the equation on the whiteboard is a transfer function for a sensor input system, and the screen the man is looking at has a data visualization that looks like sensor output. That's not definitive, but it's a reasonable inference. She filed this. She filed this alongside the throttle body and the Soren Vidal moment, and the phone call from Arthur Webb, and the way he'd said the word properly just now. I'll set up a weekly coordination meeting, she said. Don't do it because I said something. Do it after you've confirmed whether the inference is right. Right? She looked at him. You don't like being cited. I like being accurate, he said. Citing me before you've checked is just replacing one authority problem with another. She thought about that for the rest of the morning, through the meeting with Daniel, which went well, better than she'd expected, with both men finding a common language quickly in the way that people who are both primarily interested in how things work tend to find common language, bypassing the usual professional pleasantries in favor of just talking about the technical questions. And through the introduction to Priya, which was the one she'd been most curious about. Priya Nair was 29 and had been on the Prometheus team for 2.5 years and had, in that time, learned the specific political shape of a room in which the most senior person had strong opinions, which was that you said less than you knew and waited for an opening. With Marcus gone and Daniel newly elevated, the shape of the room was changing, and Priya was still calibrating. Victoria could see it, the watchfulness, the controlled delivery, the ideas arriving in her speech with slight hesitation before them, like someone checking a door before opening it. Ethan talked to her for 12 minutes. Victoria sat nearby and said almost nothing. By the 3rd minute, Priya's delivery had changed. Not dramatically, she wasn't a different person, but the hesitation was gone, or most of it, and she was talking about the aerodynamic subsystem with the velocity of someone who had been waiting to talk about it at full speed for a long time. She had 3 specific ideas about how the predictive response could be improved in the next production run, and she delivered all 3 of them without checking whether the room approved. Ethan asked 2 questions. Both of them were precise enough to demonstrate that he'd understood what she was saying completely, and both of them pushed on the actual weak points in each idea rather than on peripheral concerns. And Priya answered both of them in a way that said the weak points were things she'd already thought about and had partial answers for. After she left, Ethan said to Victoria, "She's going to be better than your last CTO in about 3 years." 2, Victoria said. He looked at her. I've been watching her for 6 months. I just didn't have the right frame for what I was seeing. She stood. I'm trying to fix that. He nodded. He looked out the window at the engineering floor, at the ongoing parallel work of people who didn't know they were working on the same thing. You fixed the car, she said. You fixed it in 23 minutes after 17 days of it being broken. But that's not actually the thing you did, is it? He looked at her. The car was going to get fixed eventually. Someone would have found it. Maybe the Stuttgart firm on their 3rd try, maybe Daniel on his own, maybe someone else. The car was going to get fixed. She paused. What you did was show this entire organization what it looks like when the work is the only thing in the room. No politics, no self-protection, no managing of outcomes, just someone who came in and looked at a problem with completely clean eyes. He was quiet for a moment. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. Clean eyes aren't a virtue. They're just what happens when you don't have a stake in the answer being a particular thing. And how do you get to that place? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, in the way he thought about things, without rushing to an answer, without filling the space. You have to lose something first, he said. Something you thought was the point, and then figure out what was actually the point. She thought about her grandfather's shop, about the high school teacher from Tempe, about a photograph on a desk. And the work was actually the point. For me, he said. Yeah. She looked at him for a moment. He was standing in the hallway of her engineering wing in his gray shirt with the faded logo, and he looked exactly as out of place and exactly as at home as he'd looked the first time she'd seen him walk across the showroom floor. and she understood now that those two things were not in tension. That was just what he looked like. That was just what he was. "Same time next week?" she said. "I'll be here," he said, and picked up his bag and walked back toward the entrance the way he'd come. She watched him go and thought about the retainer agreement that Kevin would have drafted by end of day and that Ethan would probably read carefully and sign without making it an event, and about the Thursday visits that would follow, and about what it was going to feel like to run a company where that was a normal part of how things worked, where the standard process included someone in a gray shirt who would look at the problem without caring what the answer was supposed to be. It would be friction, some of it. Some of the team would resist it. Priya wouldn't, but others would. And that was a thing she was going to have to manage, which she had told Ethan honestly, and she meant it. She walked back to her office through the connecting walkway and sat down and looked at the desert, which was doing the thing it always did, existing without commentary, large and ancient and indifferent to the specifics of anyone's problems. She thought about the laugh. She thought about it the way she'd been thinking about it for weeks, not with guilt exactly, but with a kind of ongoing inventory. What it had cost, what it had clarified, what it would cost if she let herself forget it. She was not going to put it in a drawer. She was going to keep it on the surface where it was useful. 23 minutes, $899. A firmware conflict that everyone else had been too close to see. And underneath that, quietly, 4 patents in 18 months and the particular genius of someone who had built the skeleton of a thing that would later make a racing driver sit in silence for 20 seconds because he couldn't find the right words for what he'd just felt. She opened her laptop. She had a dozen things waiting. She started on the first one, and outside the desert was warm and the sky was clearing, and somewhere in Mesa a man was back at his workbench with his coffee mug and his clean eyes and the work that was its own point and its own reward. The retainer agreement arrived in Ethan's email on a Friday afternoon, 7 pages with a cover note from someone named Kevin, who wrote with the efficient warmth of a person who had been trained to be helpful without being familiar. Ethan read the agreement twice at the workbench with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, made 2 minor edits in pen on a printed copy, scanned it, and sent it back the same evening. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He set the signed copy in his outbox folder, finished what he'd been working on, a fuel pressure regulator rebuild on a client's vintage Lamborghini Espada that had taken 3 hours longer than he'd estimated, because the part history was incomplete and he'd had to reverse engineer the specification from the original design drawings. And then he locked the shop and drove home and made dinner and went to bed at 10 o'clock, which was what he did most nights. He lay in the dark for a while before sleep and thought about Thursday, about Daniel Okafor's questions, which had been good questions, the kind that came from someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than performing understanding, about Priya and the way her posture had changed in the first few minutes of their conversation, that almost imperceptible unlocking, about Victoria in the hallway saying you fixed the car in 23 minutes, but that's not actually the thing you did. He wasn't sure she was right about that. He thought the car was probably the thing he did, but he understood what she was reaching for, and he wasn't going to argue with someone who was in the process of figuring out the right question to ask. He had been in that process himself for a long time, still was, in some ways. He fell asleep thinking about the throttle body on the Ferrari 348, which he needed to finish in the morning, and whether the client was going to want the original factory torque spec or the revised spec that the marquee community had generally settled on as more reliable in the current fuel environment. It was the kind of question that had no single right answer, which was why it was still with him when he fell asleep and still with him, briefly, when he woke up. The first Thursday visit established the pattern. He arrived at 9. He spent an hour with Daniel going through the documentation on the next development project. A lower-priced performance vehicle Sterling was planning for a broader market, internally designated Project Meridian, which was in early engineering stages and had the slightly unformed quality of something that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. Daniel was good in these conversations. He had the engineer's tendency to go deep on individual systems at the expense of the whole, but he was aware of the tendency and worked against it, which was more than most people managed. After Daniel, he spent time on the engineering floor. Not in any formal capacity. He didn't have a workstation, didn't attend the team meetings, wasn't on the internal communication channels. He walked the floor and looked at what people were working on, and occasionally asked a question, and the question was always the kind that invited someone to explain their thinking rather than their conclusion. And often the person explaining their thinking discovered something in the explanation that they hadn't fully seen in the conclusion. This was not a method he had invented. It was just what happened when you were genuinely curious and didn't have a stake in the answer. The team's response to him was mixed in exactly the way he'd told Victoria it would be. Daniel was openly receptive. Priya was engaged in a way that was almost hungry, the way people are when they've been working in a partial vacuum and suddenly have access to someone who takes their ideas seriously and can stress test them without politics. Two of the senior engineers, men who had been at Sterling for 7 and 9 years respectively, and had developed the deep groove comfort of people whose institutional knowledge is their professional security, were visibly uncomfortable with his presence, in the specific way of people who feel that an outsider's competence is a commentary on their own. He understood this and did not take it personally and did not pretend it wasn't there. In his third week, one of the two uncomfortable senior engineers, a man named Craig who worked on chassis dynamics and had a manner that suggested he'd been right about things enough times to have stopped questioning whether he was right, came to him in the hallway after a floor session with a specific challenge. "I want to show you something," Craig said, in the tone of someone who means, "I want to show you why you're wrong." Ethan said sure and followed him to his workstation. Craig pulled up a simulation. It was a suspension geometry model for the Meridian project, complex and clearly the product of significant time investment. He walked Ethan through the parameters with the brisk efficiency of someone who expected to be interrupted and was ready to defend each point. Ethan listened without interrupting. When Craig finished, Ethan said, "The front anti-roll bar rate. Why did you land there?" Craig told him. "What happens at the transition between 35 and 45 miles per hour in a sharp left with lateral load?" A pause. Craig pulled up a different view of the simulation. He ran the scenario. Something happened in the data that was small and would have been easy to miss. Craig looked at it for a moment. "That's within tolerance." "It is," Ethan agreed. "But in a car this size, at that weight distribution, the driver is going to feel it as hesitation. Not dangerous, just off." Craig was quiet for a moment. He ran the scenario again, slightly different parameters. "You'd need to recalibrate the rear rate too if you change the front," Ethan said. "I know. It's a 2-hour adjustment." "I know that too." They looked at the screen together. Craig had the expression of someone who had come to a conversation expecting a fight and found instead that the person he was fighting was looking at the same thing he was looking at and seeing it clearly. "I'll run the recalibration," Craig said, finally. "You don't have to tell her it came from me," Ethan said. "Tell her you caught it in review." Craig looked at him. "Why?" "Because it'll be easier for you in the room, and because it doesn't matter where it came from, it matters that it gets fixed." Craig was quiet for a long moment. He had a complicated expression. Not grateful exactly, but something in the territory of recalibration, a man updating a prior. "That's a strange way to operate," he said. "It works for me," Ethan said. Don't. 6 weeks into the retainer arrangement, Victoria called a meeting she hadn't told him about in advance. He arrived on a Thursday morning, and Kevin, whom he'd now met enough times to have a nodding acquaintance with, the kind built on mutual recognition that they were both people who preferred to get things done over discussing getting things done, told him that Victoria wanted to see him before the floor time. He went to her office. She was at her desk, which was unusual. When he arrived, she was normally in motion, between things, catching him in transit. Today she was sitting, and there was something on the desk that she hadn't touched yet. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I need to show you something." She turned the desk screen toward him. It was a document. He looked at it for a moment before understanding what he was reading. It was a formal credit notice. Sterling Performance Motors Internal Records, the company's official engineering history of the Prometheus project, amended. The amendment, dated 2 weeks prior, added a section titled Original Powertrain Architecture, and the section listed the 5 members of the Helix program team, with Ethan Mercer's name at the top and his role described as Lead Powertrain Integration Engineer, primary inventor on patents SPM 7741 through SPM 7744. He looked at it for a moment. It's in the permanent record, she said. The board has a copy. The engineering team has a copy. When we file the full production documentation with the relevant regulatory bodies, this is part of the package. She paused. I told you I was going to do this. You did? I wanted you to see it rather than just hear about it. He looked at the screen. He thought about the 18 months, about the meetings where he'd pushed for the design decision that Marcus had overridden and that had turned out to be right. About the day he'd walked out of kinetics engineering with a box of personal effects and a very clear sense that the thing he'd built was going to get used and his name was not going to be on it. He thought about the 14 years. Thank you, he said. You're not going to tell me I didn't have to. No. She looked at him. How does it feel? He thought about that honestly. Strange, he said. Smaller than I would have expected it to feel if you told me this was coming 10 years ago. Smaller good or smaller complicated? Smaller accurate, he said. The work was real. The record is real. Whether it's in the file or not doesn't change what I built. He looked at the screen one more time. But it's right. It's the accurate thing, and accuracy matters, so it feels right. She nodded. She turned the screen back. I have something else to tell you. He waited. The International Exhibition Circuit is planning a showcase in October. Not Geneva this time, so Los Angeles. Domestic. Larger audience, broader press coverage. The Prometheus is being featured as the centerpiece of a segment on next-generation powertrain architecture. She looked at him steadily. The exhibition organizers want to include an engineering perspective in the programming. A presentation, not a sales pitch, not a press event. Something substantive about the technical development. He understood where this was going. I want to give them your name, she said. Victoria. I know what you're going to say. Then I won't bother saying it. Say it anyway. He looked at her. I don't want to be on a stage talking about my own work. That's not what the arrangement is. It wouldn't be about promoting yourself. It would be about the engineering, the actual architecture, the design decisions, the technical choices, the things that made the car what it is. She leaned forward slightly. There are engineers in this industry, young ones, people who are building the next generation of this kind of work, who would benefit from hearing that story told accurately by someone who was actually in it. Not the press version, not the corporate history version, the real one. He was quiet. You told me the work should be the thing, she said. This is a version of that, not promotion, just the work presented as the work. He looked at the window. Outside, the desert was doing its late summer thing, the heat haze making the air above the distant highway shimmer in a way that was either beautiful or oppressive, depending on how you'd spent your morning. How long is the presentation? He said. 20 minutes. Maybe a brief Q&A after. I'd need to structure it technically. Not a story about the company. Not a biography. Yes. And I'd want to include the Helix team. All 5 of us. If I'm telling the story of how the engine was built, I'm not telling it as if I built it alone. I'll make sure there's space in the program for that. He turned back from the window. Send me the details. She didn't quite smile, but something in her expression shifted in the direction of it. Kevin will have them to you by end of week. I'll probably hate the whole thing, he said. Probably. I hate speaking in front of people. I know, you've mentioned. I haven't mentioned it. You inferred it. You're very easy to read when you're uncomfortable, she said. In situations where you're comfortable, you're not. But the concept of a room full of people watching you say words about yourself is clearly not a comfortable situation. He looked at her. How long did it take you to figure that out? About 2 weeks into the Thursdays? He shook his head slightly. You've gotten better at reading people. I had incentive to practice, she said simply. October in Los Angeles had its own particular weather that was nothing like Phoenix and nothing like Geneva, a kind of dry warmth layered with something almost marine at the edges, the Pacific making itself known at the margins of the heat. The exhibition space was in a converted industrial building in the Arts District. Exposed brick, high ceilings, the kind of venue that had been a warehouse in a previous life and retained the structural memory of utility while being dressed up for another purpose. Ethan arrived at the venue the morning of the exhibition alone, without any of the Sterling team, because he'd told Victoria he needed to see the space before the people were in it. She had arranged this without comment, which he appreciated. He walked the floor for 20 minutes. The Prometheus was already installed on its display platform, under a work light that was less flattering than the eventual exhibition lighting would be. And in that raw illumination, the car looked like what it actually was. A machine. Not a sculpture, not a status object. A machine built to do a specific thing at a specific level of capability. The engineering was visible in the construction in a way that the polished exhibition lighting would partly obscure. He stood in front of it for a while. The throttle body on the Ferrari 348 had been returned to its owner 3 weeks ago, and the client had called afterward to say that the car drove like it had 20 years ago, which was the best possible outcome and the one Ethan had been aiming for. He had a waiting list now, which was a development of the last 2 months, partly attributable to industry word of mouth, and partly to a brief mention in a diagnostic trade publication that had described the Prometheus fix in general terms without naming him specifically, but it identified the nature of the methodology with enough precision that people who knew what they were reading had understood who was being described. He hadn't sought that out. It had happened anyway, which was generally how things happened when they were going to happen. The Meridian project was in mid-development now, and the suspension recalibration that Craig had run, the one that Craig had presented to Daniel as something he'd caught in review, which was what Ethan had suggested and which was accurate enough given that he had caught it in a review, just not alone, had been integrated into the working design and had prevented a specific handling characteristic that would have generated exactly the press language Marcus had been afraid of for the Prometheus. Not quite as crisp as you'd expect. Craig still wasn't warm toward him exactly, but he brought questions now, specific technical questions, delivered in the direct way of someone who had decided that the information was worth more than the ego management it would have previously required. Ethan answered the questions and they moved on, and that was the working relationship, which was the only kind of relationship that was necessary in that context. Priya had been elevated to lead aerodynamics engineer on the Meridian project 2 months in, a move that Daniel had recommended and Victoria had approved without hesitation. She had come to find Ethan on a Thursday after it was announced and told him with the directness of someone still practicing directness. "I know you said something to her about me." "I said you were good," he said, "which is true." "What exactly did you say?" "That you'd be better than the last CTO in about 3 years. She had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had said, "Why 3 years? Why not 2? He had almost laughed. "Because you still hesitate before the big claim. You're right, but you hesitate. When you stop hesitating, it'll be 2. She had taken that in the way she took things, seriously, without defensiveness, filing it for use. He thought about her now, looking at the Prometheus on its platform, and about the fact that some version of the architecture she was building her career on had come from this engine, from these decisions, from 18 months of work in a room full of people who were all trying to figure out something nobody had done before. That was the thing about building something foundational. You built it, and people built on it, and eventually the building on was so high that the foundation was invisible, and that was actually the sign of a good foundation. That it was invisible because it was load-bearing, because everything above it was putting its weight on it, and it was holding. The exhibition lighting came on at noon, and the car transformed under it, the carbon fiber panels catching the light in the way they'd been designed to catch it. Ethan watched the transformation and thought, there it is. The showroom version, the version designed to make people feel something. He felt it too. He was not immune to it, but he also knew what was underneath it. The presentation was at 3 p.m. in a side room off the main exhibition floor, a space set up with about 80 chairs that were, when he walked in at 2:55, mostly full. He had not expected this. He had expected 40 people, maybe 50. The room was full, and there were people standing at the back. He stood at the edge of the room for a moment, taking this in. Victoria appeared at his shoulder. She had been moving through the exhibition all day in the particular mode of a CEO at a company event. Present everywhere, absorbed nowhere, one part of her attention always on the room as a whole. She looked at the crowd, and then at him. 83 people, she said, plus 7 standing. I can see that. You're going to be fine. You don't know that. I know that you've been thinking about what you're going to say for 6 weeks, and you only wrote any of it down in the last 2, which means the part you wrote down is the part you couldn't hold in your head anymore, which means everything else is solid. He looked at her. How do you know how long I've been thinking about it? Because you've mentioned it exactly once 3 weeks ago in passing and never again. And you're not someone who drops things. You're someone who goes quiet when they're working. He did not have a response to this that wasn't an acknowledgement that she was right, so he said nothing, which was also an acknowledgement. He walked to the front of the room. He had a laptop with 12 slides, and he had decided before he came that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it without a podium, because a podium put the object between himself and the people, and the object was never the point. He stood at the front of the room with the laptop on a side table and the slides projected behind him, and looked at the 83 people and the 7 standing, and felt the specific discomfort of someone who had spent 14 years perfecting the art of being in rooms where nobody was looking at them. He started talking. He talked about the Helix program, not the corporate version, not Project Genesis and stakeholder alignment and innovation roadmap. He talked about the actual work, the specific decisions, the argument he'd had with himself for 3 weeks about the firing order. The night one of the other engineers had found an error in the intercooling staging calculation at 11 p.m., and they'd all stayed until 2 a.m. to recalculate it by hand because none of them trusted the software model after what they'd found. The moment the first prototype engine ran on the test stand and the sound it made, which was not the sound any of them had predicted, and was better. He talked about the 4 other engineers. He named them. Arthur Webb, who had called Victoria from across the country to say something kind about someone he'd worked with 14 years ago. Martin Cho, who had gone on to a position at a Japanese manufacturer. Diane Reyes, who had left the automotive industry entirely to teach engineering at a university in Colorado. James Park, who had retired early and was, last Ethan had heard, building a replica racing car in his garage in Montana. He said, "These 5 people spent 18 months building something foundational, and the word foundational is easy to say and hard to understand unless you've been a foundation. A foundation is invisible. A foundation is the thing that holds the weight of everything above it without anyone thinking about the fact that it's holding. A good foundation doesn't fail, and when something doesn't fail, people don't think about it. They think about the thing that's standing on it." He paused. The room was very quiet. He said, "I spent a long time being bothered by that, being a foundation and not being seen as a foundation. There's a version of that situation that makes a person bitter, and I lived in that version for a while, and it cost me things I didn't need to lose. Time, mostly. The years I spent being angry at the invisibility instead of understanding what the invisibility actually meant." He looked at a point at the back of the room, just above the heads of the people standing. He said, "What it meant was that the thing worked. If the foundation is visible, it's usually because something above it has cracked, and people are looking down at what they're standing on and asking why it's not holding. When the foundation is invisible, it's because it's doing its job. That's not consolation. That's the actual measure." He clicked to the last slide. It was a technical schematic, the core architecture of the Helix engine platform, clean and precise, the kind of drawing that was beautiful if you understood what you were looking at, and abstract if you didn't. Some people in the room leaned forward, some sat back. He noted the lean-forward people, the way he always noted things. He said, "The Prometheus has a $5 million price tag and a carbon fiber body and an aerodynamic system that could write a thesis. All of that is real and all of that matters. But the sound it makes when it starts, the particular sound, the specific character of it, comes from this. From a decision about firing order that 5 people argued about for weeks. The car sounds like it sounds because of work that was done in a room where nobody outside the room was watching." He said, "That's most of the work that matters. It happens where nobody's watching, and the measure of it isn't recognition. The measure of it is whether the thing works." He said, "I hope some of you are building things where nobody's watching. I hope you understand that invisible and unimportant are not the same word." He stopped. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Afterward, there was a Q&A that ran 25 minutes longer than scheduled because the moderator couldn't find a stopping point that felt right and eventually just let it run. The questions were good, specific, technical, from people who understood what he'd been describing and had follow-up questions about the actual engineering decisions. He answered them directly and without hedging and twice said, "I don't know," which was the accurate answer and which produced a response in the room that surprised him slightly, the way a room responds when someone says a thing that isn't usually said in that context. After the Q&A, people came to find him. Not all 83, but enough. Engineers, mostly young, some of them with the specific intensity of people who were working on problems they hadn't yet solved, and were hoping that proximity to someone who had solved a version of the problem would transfer something useful. He talked to all of them. He was there for an hour and a half. Victoria found him after, when the room was mostly cleared and the exhibition floor was in the wind-down phase. The crowd thinning, the lighting shifted slightly in the way that event lighting shifts when the event is transitioning from active to closing. "An hour and a half," she said. "I know. You hate talking to people. I hate talking in front of people. These were conversations." She looked at him with an expression that was readable, which was something he'd noticed about her in the weeks of Thursdays. She had gotten easier to read, or he had gotten better at reading her, or both. The expression said, "I see you." Not in the performed way of someone delivering insight. Just, "I see you, and what I see is specific and real." "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things. "Like, I've been working in a room by myself for a long time, and someone opened a window," he said. "It's good. It's also a lot. Both can be true." Both are true. They walked out of the side room onto the exhibition floor, which was in the late-day beauty of an event ending well. The kind of beauty that only exists at the close of things, when the pressure is off, and the people who remain are the ones who genuinely want to be there. The Prometheus sat on its platform under the softened light, and a few people were still around it, still looking, the way people look at things that have satisfied something in them that they couldn't quite name in advance. Ethan stopped at the edge of the exhibition floor and looked at the car. He thought about the morning he'd come in early, before the lights were up, and stood in front of it under the work light. The machine version, without the presentation. He had known it then the way he always knew things, not with sentiment, but with the particular clarity of understanding that came from having been inside the making of something. He knew it now differently. Not better or worse, just differently. In the way you know a thing differently when you've said it out loud to 83 people and they understood what you were saying. "I should go," he said. "I know." Victoria was standing beside him, also looking at the car. "The shop is open tomorrow?" 7 o'clock. "Anything interesting?" A 1988 Porsche 930 with a boost control issue that the previous shop misdiagnosed as a turbo failure. "The turbo's fine. It's a wastegate actuator." He paused. "And a 2003 Ferrari 360 with something in the gearbox that the owner described as a kind of grinding at high revs that comes and goes, which is approximately the least useful description of a problem I've ever received, so that'll be a full diagnostic from scratch." Victoria almost laughed. "Do you enjoy that? Starting from scratch?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "That's the honest answer. The scratch is the interesting part." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of it." "You already thanked me." "I know. I'm doing it again." He nodded once. He picked up his bag. He looked at the Prometheus one more time, at the car that had started this, that had been the specific reason a woman in a red dress had laughed at him in a showroom, and that had brought him back here, to this floor, to this city, to a room of 83 people who had leaned forward when he talked about firing orders and intercooling calculations and the invisible work of being a foundation. He was not sentimental about it. Sentiment was a thing he'd learned to be careful with, because it tended to arrive after the fact and rewrite things in ways that weren't always accurate. What he felt instead was something simpler and more durable. Satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. Not just the firmware conflict in the Prometheus. That had been the obvious problem, the presenting complaint. The longer problem. The one that had taken 14 years and a woman's laugh and a diagnostic that cost $899 to begin to resolve. He didn't know if it was fully resolved. He wasn't sure resolution was a state you arrived at and stayed in. He thought it was more like the foundation he'd described to the room. You maintained it, you checked it, you made adjustments when the load above it shifted. You didn't declare it finished and walk away. You showed up on Thursdays and answered the questions and told the young engineer to stop hesitating before the big claim and took the calls from the CEO at whatever hour the calls came. That was the work. That was what the work actually was, past the firmware and the patents and the presentation. He walked out of the exhibition hall into the Los Angeles evening, which was warm and slightly marine at the edges, the city doing its city thing in all directions at once. He found his truck in the parking structure and sat in it for a moment before starting it, listening to the ambient sound of the structure. Other cars, a ventilation system, the distant compression of the city outside. He thought about Arthur Webb, who had called a CEO he'd never met to say something kind about someone he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. He had called Arthur the day after Victoria gave him the number. The call had lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than either of them had planned, and at the end Arthur had said, "I always thought about calling and didn't," and then he had said, "I'm glad you called first," which was the most generous possible reading of a situation that wasn't entirely his fault and wasn't entirely not. And Ethan had accepted the generosity of it because that was what you did when someone offered it in good faith. He thought about Priya, who was going to be better than the last CTO in 2 years, not 3, and who would probably do something in those 2 years that nobody had thought to do before, because she was the kind of person who stopped hesitating and then moved fast. He thought about Daniel Okafor, who asked the right question on the second try even when he didn't ask it on the first, which was a better average than most. He thought about Victoria, who had laughed at him and come back and apologized and come back again and changed the company's permanent record and organized a room of 83 people to hear him talk about firing orders, and who was not the same person she'd been on the morning she walked into her own showroom in a red dress and looked at a man carrying a laptop sleeve and filed him under a category that didn't fit. People changed. That was a thing he believed in, the practical, non-idealized way of someone who had watched it happen and not happen and learned to tell the difference. They changed when the cost of not changing became specific enough to feel. Not theoretical, specific. A number. A car that wouldn't start. A laugh in a room full of people who were watching. He started the truck. He drove out of the parking structure into the Los Angeles evening and merged onto the surface street heading toward the freeway. And around him the city moved at the speed cities moved, indifferent and continuous, full of people on their way to and from things that mattered to them in ways nobody outside their own lives could fully measure. He thought about the 9:30 waiting for him in the morning, the wastegate actuator, the shop at 7, the coffee maker that had been in service for years past the point where most people would have replaced it. He thought about the sound the Prometheus made when Daniel Okafor touched the starter contact and the engine came alive in the Sterling showroom on a morning when nobody in the room had expected it to, and the way that sound had filled the space, and the engineers had made sounds they hadn't planned to make, and the car had run steady and clean, like it had never had a problem at all. That was the sound of a thing that worked. He had known what it would sound like before he fixed it, because he had helped build the thing that made it sound that way, and that knowledge was his regardless of what any file or record or public occasion said about it. But it was good. It was accurate. And accuracy, as he had told a room of 83 people in the middle of an October afternoon in Los Angeles, was the measure. He got on the freeway. The city opened up around him, wide and lit and full of itself in the particular way of cities that have never learned to be modest about the fact of their own existence. He drove through it at the speed of everything else, one truck among many, heading east toward the desert, toward the shop, toward the morning. Behind him, in the converted warehouse in the Arts District, the Prometheus sat on its platform in the closing light of the exhibition, and the last few people standing near it were looking at it the way people look at things they've understood something from without quite being able to articulate what. The car had been built by 5 people in a room where nobody was watching. It would outlast the story of how it almost didn't run. And somewhere in the permanent record of the company that bore his name, the name Ethan Mercer was listed accurately, first among equals, for the work he had done and never stopped having done, regardless of who had known about it or when. He did not need to be in the room for the applause. He had been in the room where the work was done. That was the room that counted.